His knuckles were split and bleeding. His voice cracked like timber in a drought. And every soul in Ember Flats stood frozen on that dusty main street, waiting to hear what a man says when the lie he married becomes the truth he'd die for. You want to know why I stayed? Colt Reardon's words cut through the silence like a blade. Not for the land, not for the debt. I stayed because somewhere between a borrowed wedding dress and a barn I had no right to sleep in, I fell in love with my own wife. Nora Whitfield's face went the color of chalk, but she didn't look away. If you want to see how this ends, follow this channel, hit like and drop your city in the comments. I want to know how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to the beginning. The marriage certificate was still warm from the minister's hand when Colt Reardon walked out of that church 3 paces ahead of his new wife and didn't look back. The afternoon sun hammered Ember Flats without mercy, bleaching the storefronts pale and throwing sharp shadows across the rutted main street. Colt's jaw was set so tight his back teeth ached. He'd signed papers this morning that felt less like a union and more like a sentence, and the shame of it pressed against his ribs, the way a bad saddle bruises a horse slow at first, then impossible to ignore. Behind him, he heard her footsteps. Careful, quiet, like she was apologizing just by existing. He'd heard about Nora Whitfield the way men hear about weather, secondhand and unflattering. 32 years old and never once been courted seriously. Her father's farm sat 5 miles east of town, and the joke was that old Whitfield had more luck with his wheat than his daughter had with suitors. Nobody said it kindly. Colt hadn't cared about any of that 2 weeks ago, when Edmund Voss had laid the terms across that mahogany desk like cards in a game he'd already won. "You owe the bank $3,000, Voss had said, leaning back in his leather chair, fingers laced across the front of his vest. "Money you do not have. I could seize your horse, your rig, your gear, and you'd still come up short." He'd smiled then, thin and satisfied. Or, Colt had known that or was coming the way a man knows a storm. He could smell it. Nora Whitfield needs a husband. Her father's will requires she marry within 6 months of his passing, or the land reverts to the bank. "I've arranged for the debt to be forgiven in full if you marry her." Does she know? She knows she needs a husband. She knows you need relief. That's sufficient. It wasn't, not even close. But Colt had signed anyway because he had nothing left, and a signed paper was something, even if it was the wrong kind of something. Now he stood on the boardwalk in front of his own wagon, waiting while his new wife navigated the church steps, in a dress that didn't fit her properly, too tight at the shoulders, borrowed from someone with a smaller frame, the hem pinned up an inch on one side and not the other. She walked with her chin level and her eyes on the ground, like a woman who had long since learned to keep her dignity in places that refused to give it to her. "Well, well," the voice oozed across the street like something spoiled. "If it ain't the happy couple." Deke Salter stood outside the saloon, arms folded, grinning like he'd won something. He was a big man with small eyes and a bigger mouth than either warranted. Half the street seemed to have materialized from nowhere to enjoy the spectacle. "Congratulations, Reardon," someone called. Laughter followed, ragged and mean. Colt's hands curled into fists at his sides. "Let's just go." Nora's voice was so quiet it barely registered, but he heard it, and something about the steadiness of it. No tears, no embarrassment, just quiet, weathered endurance stopped him cold. He turned and looked at her. Really looked at her for the first time since they'd stood in front of the minister. She had brown hair pulled back too severely, like she'd given up on it being pretty, and decided to make it practical instead. Her eyes were dark and direct, and she was not looking at the crowd, she was looking at him. Not asking for anything, just waiting to see what he'd do. He didn't offer his hand when she reached the wagon. She didn't wait for it. She gripped the wheel and hauled herself up, settling on the far edge of the bench, as far from him as the width of the seat allowed. Colt climbed up and snapped the reins harder than necessary. The horses lurched. They left Ember Flats behind without a word spoken between them. The laughter trailed them out of town. The Whitfield farm announced itself in stages. First the fence line, then the smell of turned earth, then the farmhouse itself, small and square, and stubbornly upright, the kind of building that had been weathered and repaired so many times it had a certain defiant character about it. The barn was older than the house and listed slightly to the east, but its hinges were oiled and its doors shut clean. Colt had seen the property once before, the day Voss had spread a survey map across his desk like a conqueror showing off his territory. Rich bottomland, good water access, a creek that ran spring through fall. worth more than the asking price always had been. He'd filed that information away without examining why Voss seemed so pleased about it. They pulled into the yard. Nora stepped down from the wagon before Colt had fully stopped it. "There's a room in the barn," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Clean bedding, a proper frame. You can sleep there if you prefer." Colt climbed down slowly. "You offering or assuming?" "I'm being practical." "It's Colt." A pause. "I know your name." "Then use it." Nora met his eyes for just a moment, long enough for him to see something complicated moving behind them, then looked away. "The room's there if you want it. Supper's at 6. She walked toward the house. Colt stood in the yard holding his saddlebags, listening to the particular quiet of a place that had been home to someone else for a long time. The barn smelled of hay and old wood and careful work. The spare room was barely bigger than a broom closet, but the floor was swept, and the window faced east to catch the morning light. He dropped his gear on the narrow bed and sat down. This was his life now. Married to a woman he didn't know, sleeping in a barn 5 miles outside a town that had just made a joke of them both. All because he'd been desperate and stupid and signed a paper without reading it all the way through. He stayed in the barn that night. He didn't go in for supper. Instead, he rode back into Ember Flats and found a stool at the saloon bar and a bottle of whiskey and the particular kind of silence that comes from being surrounded by people who know exactly what you've done. He didn't get the silence. "Look who crawled out of the barn." Deke Salter's voice carried across the room like a bad smell. He was at a corner table with 3 other men, all of them angled toward Colt with the lazy interest of people who've been waiting for entertainment. Colt set his glass down and stared forward. "Must be real comfortable out there on the Whitfield place," Deke continued louder. "Though I hear the old maid keeps the house so tight she barely lets herself breathe. Imagine what she's like with a husband she didn't—" Colt was off the stool before he finished the sentence. He crossed the room in 4 steps and had Deke by the collar slammed against the wall, hard enough to rattle the mirror above the bar. "Say her name again," Colt said. His voice was very quiet. "Go ahead." Deke's eyes went wide, but his smirk held on by stubbornness. "Touchy for a man who married her for—" "That's enough," the barkeeper's voice flat and final. "Not in here." Colt held Deke there for a long count, close enough to see the sweat beating at his temple, close enough to watch the smirk waver. Then he shoved him loose and picked up the whiskey bottle from the bar and walked out. He rode back to the farm in darkness, the bottle half gone and his knuckles aching from where he'd hit the wall instead of Deke's face. The house was dark when he arrived. He put the horse up properly, hung the tack, forked a little extra hay. Good habits were the only habits he had left. He was crossing toward the barn when the kitchen window caught his eye. A single candle burned on the table inside. Nora sat before it, a book open in front of her, but she wasn't reading. She was just sitting there, both hands flat on the table, staring at something only she could see. She looked the way loneliness looks when a person stops trying to hide it. Colt stood in the dark yard and watched her for longer than he should have. Then he pushed the feeling away and went to bed. Morning came in hard and bright. He woke to the sound of hammering. He pulled himself upright, dragged on his boots, and stepped out into a sunrise that didn't have the decency to be subtle. The hammering was coming from the north fence line where Nora was driving new posts into the ground, with clean, methodical stroke, shirt already damp at the collar hair, in a braid that had started the day neat and was now half undone from the work. His pocket watch said 10 minutes before 6. "Fence been broken long," he called, walking over. She startled, nearly dropped the maul, turned face flushed with effort, and something else surprised maybe that he was awake. "Few weeks. Cattle kept getting through. You fixing it alone. No one else to do it." Colt looked down the fence line. She'd already replaced 4 posts. The ground out here was dry and stubborn. Driving post by hand was harder than it looked when you were the one doing it. He'd done enough of it in his life to know. "I can help," he heard himself say. She studied him. "You don't have to." "I know." They worked in silence for the better part of an hour. Colt took over the post driving while Nora stretched the wire and stapled it clean. They fell into a rhythm without discussing it, him setting the pace, her matching it, neither one wasting movement. When the last post was solid and the wire ran true all the way to the corner post, the sun had fully risen, and Colt's shoulders burned in a way that felt honest. "Thank you," Nora said, wiping her forehead with the back of her wrist. "It's your land." A pause. "Our land, I suppose, legally." The word legally landed differently than he expected. Not bitter, just precise. He looked at her sideways. "Is that what Voss told you, that I'd get half?" She went still. "What did he tell you?" "That I'd have access rights to work the land, something like that. Nora set down the wire tool and looked at him directly. Access isn't ownership, Colt. My father's will is specific. This land stays in my name whether I marry or not. Marriage determines whether I keep it or the bank takes it. Whatever Edmund Voss told you about partnership, none of it's legally enforceable. He stared at her. You knew. I found out 3 days before the wedding. Her voice didn't waver, but something around her eyes tightened. I tried to find a way to tell you. You wouldn't see me. And then we were standing in front of the minister and She stopped. It was too late. You let me marry you for nothing. I let you out of a debt that would have destroyed you. She held his gaze without flinching. Voss manipulated us both. The debt he holds isn't even legally collectible. It has irregularities. You could have walked away. You still can. Then why tell me now? Nora picked up the wire tool. Because I won't live inside a lie, even a practical one. She started walking back toward the barn. And because you deserve to know. She left him standing there in the fence line with the morning heating up around him and the full weight of what she'd just done settling over him like dust. She'd handed him the door, given him every reason to leave, and she'd done it knowing he might take it. That wasn't desperation. That wasn't weakness. Cole didn't know what to call it, but it made him feel the first real thing he'd felt since he signed those papers. He stayed. He spent the rest of that first day riding the property, checking water sources, walking the creek bed, studying the fields with the eye of a man who'd worked land before and knew what good ground looked like when it was being underused. And this ground was good, rich and deep with water that ran clear and fence lines that told the story of a man who'd worked hard until he couldn't anymore. Nora's father had been a careful farmer. His daughter was a careful woman. The two facts connected in Colt's mind, and he didn't examine them too closely. By evening, his stomach had made the decision for him. He came in from the barn to find Nora standing at the wood stove, her back to him, stirring something that smelled like it had been simmering all day. Made extra, she said without turning around. He washed up at the pump and came back to find 2 places set at the table. The stew was beef and root vegetables, and it was better than anything he'd eaten in 3 months. He finished 2 bowls before he realized he was being the kind of rude that happens when you forget there's another person in the room. He stopped, tried again. It's real good. My mother's recipe. She'd teach you before she passed 15 years ago. Colt did the arithmetic. You were 17. Yes. Who ran the house after? Nora pushed food around her bowl. I did. My father tried, but grief works differently in different people. He needed someone to hold things together. She paused. I learned to hold things together. The town doesn't know that about you. The town sees what it wants to see. No bitterness in her voice. Just a flat statement of fact. I stopped caring about their opinions some years back. Then why marry? He asked it before he could stop himself. If you don't care what they say, why not just let Voss take the land, start somewhere new? Nora looked up, and in the candlelight for the first time, Colt saw something that wasn't weariness or patience or careful composure. He saw fire. Because my mother is buried on this land, she said. Because my father spent his whole life building something real here. Because the law thinking a woman can't manage a farm alone doesn't make it true. She set her fork down. I am not giving Edmund Voss the satisfaction of watching me walk away from the only home I've ever had. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that happens when someone has just told you something true about themselves. Colt looked at his empty bowl. What happens now? That depends on you. Nora folded her hands on the table. You can stay or you can go. The marriage is legal either way. Voss can't touch the land now regardless. And if I stay, then you stay. She said it simply. This farm needs more than one pair of hands. 2 people can build more than one can hold together. But I won't keep you here if you'd rather be somewhere else. Colt was quiet for a moment. Then I'll stay. For now. We'll figure the rest as we go. Something shifted in Nora's face, too small and too quickly masked to name. All right then. She began clearing the dishes. Welcome home, I suppose. It wasn't much, but it was a start. 3 days settled into something like routine. Awkward, careful, wide-berth routine, the kind 2 strangers develop when they're forced to share space and have silently agreed not to make it worse than it has to be. Colt worked from first light until the day ran out of color. He repaired fences, cleared irrigation ditches, rehung the barn doors so they sat true. Nora worked alongside him when her other duties allowed, and her other duties were considerable. The house, the garden, the chickens, the accounts. She kept everything in order with a quiet efficiency that he found himself noticing more than he expected. He also noticed other things. He noticed that she woke before him every morning and that coffee was always hot and ready before he crossed the yard. He noticed the way she handled the bay mare that the previous hand had apparently ruined with rough treatment, patient low voice never forcing until the horse began to trust again. He noticed the baskets she packed every Wednesday wrapped carefully in a cloth and how she'd ride into town in the early afternoon and return with it empty. On the fourth day, he asked, "Where do you go on Wednesdays?" Supper again, the table, the candle. Nora glanced up. Clara Holt. Her husband died last winter, left her with 3 young ones and not much else. I bring food when I can. Does the town know you do that? I don't do it for the town to know. Colt turned his fork over in his fingers. Anyone else? Old Harlan Burke get his bread on Sunday. He can't bake anymore, his hands shake too bad. And the Pryor boy not related to the attorney, different family, he broke his leg 2 months ago. His mother's barely keeping up. I help when there's something to help with. You're feeding half the county. I'm feeding the people who need feeding. She said it the way other people might say, I'm breathing, like it was simply what you did. Colt set down his fork. They mock you, he said. The town. They've been mocking you your whole life by the sound of it, and you've been feeding them. Nora considered this. The women who mock me and the women who need help aren't always the same women. And even when they are hungry is hungry. He stared at her. That doesn't make you angry. It did, for a long time. She stood and began clearing the dishes. But anger is expensive. I decided to spend my energy somewhere more useful. That night, lying on the narrow bed in the guest room, he'd moved inside at Nora's suggestion on the 5th day. No ceremony, just practical. Colt stared at the ceiling for a long time. He'd come here expecting a business transaction. A name on a paper, a debt erased, a woman he could politely avoid for whatever time it took to satisfy legal requirements. What he'd found was someone whose life had been reduced to a caricature by people who'd never once looked closely enough to see what was actually there. And he'd almost been one of those people. The thought sat uneasily in his chest as he finally closed his eyes. Sunday arrived with the particular self-importance that small-town Sundays have always had. Colt hadn't been inside a church since his mother's funeral, and he had no strong inclination to change that record. Nora appeared at the barn door at 8 o'clock sharp, wearing her one good dress, the wedding dress he realized cleaned and pressed and doing better duty as her Sunday best. You coming? Not particularly. People will talk if you don't show. People talk regardless. She tilted her head slightly. Fair point. She was quiet for a moment. I'm going either way. You're welcome to come. She left. He lasted exactly 19 minutes before he saddled his horse and rode after her. He caught the wagon halfway to town. Nora glanced over when he pulled alongside. Changed your mind. Figured I'd go confirm everyone's worst opinions. Something that might have been a smile crossed her face. Try not to scowl at everyone. I don't scowl. You absolutely scowl. They arrived at the church to a ripple of silence that moved through the gathered congregation like wind through wheat. Every pair of eyes tracked them as they came up the walk and slipped into a back pew. The whispers started immediately, the kind people think are quiet and aren't. Colt felt each one like a small stone, but Nora sat straight-backed and serene beside him, her hands folded in her lap, her expression giving away nothing. She'd been sitting in this particular fire for years. She'd learned to not let it burn. He watched her profile and felt a complicated thing he didn't have a name for. After the service, he started toward the wagon. Nora's hand on his sleeve stopped him. Clara. She nodded toward a thin woman in a gray dress, 3 children clustered around her skirts like small boats around a dock. I want you to meet her. He let himself be steered over. Clara Holt had a tired face and kind eyes, and she lit up when she saw Nora, genuinely like a lamp turned on. Nora, it's so good to see you. Her gaze shifted to Colt with careful courtesy. You must be her husband. Colt Reardon, ma'am. She's mentioned you. Clara smiled. Said you'd taken on the north fence line. I'm glad she's got help. Other women gathered, Ruth Daly from the school, Mrs. Liang from the dry goods, and half a dozen others, who greeted Nora with a warmth that had nothing performative about it. Real warmth, the kind earned over years of Wednesday baskets and Sunday bread, and quiet hands offered when hands were needed. The town might have made Nora Whitfield into a figure of pity and gossip, but these women, the ones who actually knew her, had made her something else. Old Harlan Burke caught Colt's arm on the way out. The old man's grip was still strong, despite the shaking hands. "Your wife's a blessing," he said quietly. "Been holding this town up for years while it was too busy looking down on her to notice. You treat her right, boy." Colt met the old man's eyes. "I mean to." They rode home in a silence that had changed its quality, softer, somehow less defended. "You look like you wanted to hit someone in there," Nora said finally. "Only about half the congregation." She glanced at him. "That's improved from what I expected. I'm making progress." Her mouth curved, an actual smile, small but real, and it reached her eyes. He caught it in his peripheral vision and felt something shift in his chest, small and dangerous. He looked away before it could go further. Nah. That evening, he didn't go straight back to the barn after supper. He lingered at the table, turning his coffee cup in his hands, watching Nora move through the kitchen with the efficiency of someone who has done everything herself for so long that help seems like an interruption. "Want a hand with those?" he asked. She glanced over her shoulder at the dishes. "I've been washing dishes alone for 15 years. "I'm aware. I asked if you wanted help." Nora turned to face him. Those dark eyes moved over his face in careful assessment. "Why?" "Trying to be neighborly. We're married. I think we're past neighborly." "What would you call it then?" She thought about it seriously, the way she seemed to think about most things. "Partners," she said at last. "Business partners who happen to share a property. Is that what you want?" "I want what's real." Her voice was quiet. "Whatever real turns out to be between two people who didn't choose each other, I can live with that. But I can't live inside something false." Colt got up and moved to the sink. He picked up a dish towel and started drying. Nora watched him for a moment, then turned back to washing without a word. They worked side by side in the lamplight, and somehow it felt like the most honest conversation they had had yet. "Now I tell him." 2 weeks and Colt realized he'd stopped sleeping in the barn. It had happened the way most true things happen, gradually, without announcement. Staying later at the table, then dozing in the chair by the fire, then waking to find a blanket draped over him that he hadn't put there. The third time, Nora was standing in the kitchen doorway when he opened his eyes. "There's a perfectly good guest room," she said. Matter of fact, not unkind. He moved his things that afternoon. The guest room was small, but it had a real mattress and east-facing windows, and it felt strange to be inside the house domestically. Strange, the kind of strange that sits right on the edge of comfortable. 3 days later, Nora came to him at supper with a careful look on her face. "Town meeting tomorrow night," she said. "At the church. Railroad route decision. And Mayor Edmund Voss will be there." She turned her fork slowly. "People have been talking about whether this marriage is genuine. If Voss thinks it's a legal arrangement with no substance, he could try to challenge it. Find a loophole." Colt set down his fork. "On what grounds?" "That it was fraudulent. That we're strangers in a legal arrangement, not truly married in any real sense." She paused. "We do sleep in separate rooms. We barely—" She stopped. Started again. "Anyone paying close attention can see what this is." "What are you suggesting?" Color rose in her face. "That for one evening we need to look convincing. Like people who chose each other." The air between them thickened. "And after tomorrow night," Colt asked, "we go back to whatever this is." She met his eyes. "But for a few hours, Voss needs to believe." He studied her, looking for the calculation, the performance. He found nothing but a woman trying to protect the only thing she had left. "All right," he said. "We'll make them believe." The church was packed, wall to wall. Standing room in the back, faces crowded into the doorway, the murmur of a town that had come to talk about railroads and stayed to watch the Reardon marriage up close. Colt helped Nora down from the wagon, his hand at her waist a beat longer than necessary. She stiffened by reflex, then steadied. "We're newlyweds who actually like each other," she murmured as they walked toward the doors. "That's a stretch." He said it quietly, but he was almost smiling. "Don't scowl. Working on it." Edmund Voss intercepted them before they had reached a pew. He was a compact man, immaculate and cold-eyed, with the particular smile of someone who has learned to weaponize manners. "Mr. and Mrs. Reardon, what a pleasure." The way he said Mrs. Reardon dripped with skepticism dressed as warmth. "Mr. Voss." Colt put his hand to the small of Nora's back and guided her toward the middle section, away from Voss's direct line of sight. They settled into a pew close enough to be observed, close enough that their shoulders touched when either of them shifted. Nora's hands were in her lap, tightly folded. Halfway through the mayor's droning presentation on easements and survey stakes, Nora shifted slightly and her hand came to rest on Colt's knee. Not dramatic, just there. An anchor. Every muscle in his body went rigid. "Easy?" she murmured, eyes still forward. "You look like a man who's about to jump out of his own skin." Not used to this, he managed. Neither am I, her fingers pressed slightly. Voss is watching. He covered her hand with his. Her fingers went still beneath his. Better, he asked. Better, she confirmed. They sat like that for the rest of the meeting. Hands linked shoulders, touching, looking for all the world like two people who had settled into each other. It wasn't performance exactly. Colt wasn't sure what it was. When the meeting ended, Voss found them again in the doorway. Everything running smoothly out at the old Whitfield place, he asked, directing the question at Nora, but watching Colt. Better than ever, Nora said. Having good help makes all the difference. I'm sure it does. Voss's gaze traveled between them, calculating. I do hope this arrangement works out for the long term. It's not an arrangement, Colt said. It's a marriage. Voss's smile didn't move. Of course, do give my regards to your lovely wife. He tipped his hat and moved away, leaving the particular chill of a man who has just told you what he knows without saying it. Nora's hand trembled slightly in Colt's grip. He suspects, she whispered. He suspects. That's different from knowing. Colt kept his voice low, and suspicion won't hold up in any court I've ever heard of. They rode home through a dark that seemed heavier than usual. When they pulled into the yard, neither of them moved to climb down. Thank you, Nora said at last, for tonight, for playing the part. I wasn't playing. She turned to look at him. I wasn't playing along, Nora. He struggled with the words. I was being your husband, because that's what I am. On paper, she said. Yeah, he looked away. On paper. She climbed down and walked toward the house, and Colt sat in the wagon in the dark, listening to the horses breathe, realizing with a cold, certain clarity that he had just lied to her for the first time, because it wasn't just on paper anymore, and he had no idea what to do about that. 3 days after the town meeting, Colt rode into Ember Flats for supplies. He was in the middle of loading feed sacks onto the wagon when Deke Salter appeared from between two buildings flanked by the same two men from the saloon. The kind of group that isn't a coincidence. Heard you made quite the show at the meeting, Deke said, hooking his thumbs in his belt. Sitting real close, holding hands like a couple of school children. Colt kept loading. That right. We got a pool going. How long before you get bored and clear out? Deke grinned. I've got 6 weeks. Thompson here says less. She probably doesn't even let you. The next sentence ended with Deke's back hitting the side of the wagon hard enough to rattle the boards and pop 2 slats loose. Colt had him by the collar forearm across his throat, close enough to count his eyelashes. Finish that sentence, he said. Very quietly, I'm asking you to. Deke's face had gone scarlet. His smirk was still there, but it was working hard to stay. You're crazy. Colt, Clara Holt's voice from the boardwalk. She had her youngest on her hip, and her expression was the particular calm of a woman who has managed worse than this. Let him go. He's not worth a sheriff's visit. Colt held for another long beat. Then he released Deke and shoved him clear. Deke stumbled back, coughing. You're going to regret this, Reardon. Add it to my list. Colt turned back to the wagon. Clara waited until Deke had retreated before she approached. She studied Colt with careful eyes. You all right? Fine. I saw the whole thing. A pause. He said something about Nora. He did. Clara shifted the child to her other hip. When Nora told me she was getting married, I worried. I thought it's about the land, it's about survival, and she'll end up more alone than before. She looked at him steadily. I was wrong. Mrs. Holt, the way you just moved when he mentioned her name, that's not pretend, Mr. Reardon. I've lived long enough to know the difference. She started toward the mercantile, then paused. Whatever reasons you had for marrying her, what matters is what you do now. She went inside. Colt stood there with his hands still shaking, replaying the moment Deke had started to form those words. The white-hot certainty that had moved through him hadn't been principled. It hadn't been about protecting legal property or honoring a business agreement. It had been blind fury on behalf of a woman who'd done nothing to deserve a single thing this town had given her. He drove back to the farm in silence, the realization sitting in his chest like a coal that wouldn't cool. Nora was in the kitchen garden when he pulled up her hands in the dirt, a streak of mud across her forearm. She looked up when he came around the corner, and something in his face must have said it before he could. Something happened in town, she said. Ran into Deke Salter. Her expression closed down carefully. What did he say? Doesn't matter. Colt! I said it doesn't matter. The words came out harder than he intended, and he saw her flinch. He took a breath. I'm sorry, he got under my skin. What did he say about me? It wasn't a question. Same garbage this town always says. He met her eyes. And I reacted, probably more than I should have. Nora pulled off her gloves slowly. You defended me. Of course I did. Why? The question landed between them like something fragile. He looked at her, really looked, not the quick, practical glances he'd trained himself to manage, and said the most honest thing he'd said since they met. Because I didn't expect you, Nora. I came out here thinking I was marrying someone I could manage to be civil to from a distance. But you're not that person. He stopped. You're not what I thought you were. And I can't keep pretending that doesn't mean something to me. The silence stretched. Don't, she said. Her voice had gone careful in a way he hadn't heard before. Don't what? Don't say things because you feel guilty, or because Deke Salter got in your head and Clara Holt said something kind. Guilt isn't the same as... She stopped herself, turned away. I need to start dinner. She walked past him and he caught her arm, gently. Wait, Colt. What if it's not guilt? He held her gaze. What if somewhere between the fence posts and the Wednesday baskets and the way you handle that bad-tempered mare? What if I started actually wanting this to be more than an arrangement? Nora's breath caught. You've known me less than a month, she said. I know that. And I know I've given you every reason not to believe me. He released her arm, but I'm asking you to. She pulled away, wrapping her arms around herself like something she was trying to keep from spilling. I can't do this, Colt. Can't do what? Hope. The word came out bare and exposed. I've been through enough of hoping someone would see past what this town thinks of me and being wrong. Every time I hoped, it cost me something I didn't have to spare. She turned back, and her eyes were wet and furious and terrified all at once. I cannot survive hoping you're different if you're not. The words hit him like a wall. Then let me prove it, he said quietly. Not with words, with time, with showing up. And if you can't sustain it, then you'll know I was wrong about myself. He met her eyes. But I don't think I am. Nora searched his face for a long, unsteady moment. Prove it, she said at last. Not tonight, not with one conversation. Stay when it gets hard. Choose this, choose me, when you don't have to. She turned toward the house. That's the only proof that counts. She went inside. Colt stood in the garden in the cooling evening light, and he made himself a promise. That night, Colt didn't sleep. He lay in the guest room with his hands behind his head, staring at the ceiling while the moon tracked slowly across the window, and he thought about what Nora had said. Not the accusation of it, the vulnerability. The way she'd said, hope, like it was a wound she'd learned to keep bandaged. Near midnight, he heard footsteps in the hall. He got up quietly and eased his door open a crack. Nora stood at the window at the end of the corridor, silhouetted by moonlight, her arms crossed over her chest. Even from a distance, he could see her shoulders moving with the kind of breathing that people do when they're trying very hard not to make noise. She was crying. Because of him. Because of what he'd said, the reaching toward her of it, which she wanted and couldn't afford to want, and which he'd put in front of her anyway without thinking about the cost. He closed the door and sat on the edge of his bed in the dark. He'd thought he was being brave, honest. He was showing up the way Clara Holt had implied he should. But he'd been careless with it. He'd handed Nora something raw and unproven and asked her to carry it on top of everything else she was already carrying. That wasn't kindness. That was burden. In the morning, he found a note on the table. Gone to help Mrs. Holt. Back by supper. And she'd left before dawn to avoid him. He deserved that. Geheki. 2 days passed in a silence that had gone from careful to painful. Nora was unreachable, not cold, not hostile, but occupied. Constantly occupied. She found 100 things that needed doing, and she did them one after another from before sunup until well after dark. When they crossed paths, she was polite and brief, and it was exactly how things had been in that very first week for the fence posts and the Wednesday baskets and the candle in the kitchen window. Colt hated it. On the third day, he rode into town. Not for supplies, not for any errand he could name. He tied his horse outside the dry goods, pushed through the door, and stood there like a man who'd forgotten why he came in. Mrs. Liang looked up from behind the counter. She was a small, precise woman with silver-threaded hair and a manner that suggested she had seen everything and remembered all of it. Mr. Reardon, a pause. You look like a man with a question he doesn't know how to ask. I need advice, he said. She set down the bolt of calico she'd been measuring. About Nora. About how to fix something I broke. What did you break? He turned his hat in his hands. I told her I was starting to care about her. That this wasn't just business to me anymore. And she doesn't believe me. He paused. She thinks it's guilt or confusion or some reaction to the way people have been treating her. And is it? No, Mrs. Liang studied him for a long moment. Mr. Reardon, Nora Whitfield has spent her entire adult life being told she wasn't enough. Not pretty enough, not young enough, not whatever the particular judgment of the week required. She has had men come to this farm interested in her father's land while barely acknowledging she was in the room. She has been a means to an end for so many people that she stopped expecting to be anything else. She folded her hands on the counter. When a man who married her to erase a debt suddenly claims genuine feeling, why on earth would she believe him? The truth of it went in like a nail. What do I do? He asked. Show her. Mrs. Liang's voice was patient but direct. Not once, not dramatically, consistently, small daily without expecting gratitude or progress in return. Show her when there's no audience, when it doesn't benefit you, when she can't see any reason for it other than the fact that you mean it. She picked up the calico again. Love is a choice, Mr. Reardon, not a feeling that happens to you. The feeling is easy. The choice is what matters. Colt left the dry goods, with Mrs. Liang's words rearranging something in the way he thought about things. He could do that. He would do that. Who says? That evening, for the first time, Colt made dinner. It was not a triumph. The cornbread came out too dark on the bottom and the beans were undersalted, and he burned his forearm on the stovepipe twice. But when Nora came in from her evening chores and stopped in the kitchen doorway, the look on her face, cautious, confused, trying not to show either, was worth the burned arm. What's this? She asked. Supper. He gestured at the table. Sit down. She sat slowly, eyes moving between him and the food. They ate. The cornbread was not good. Nora ate it without comment. When they were done, Colt started clearing the table. I can do that, Nora said. I know. He kept clearing. You were right the other day. You asked for proof instead of words, and that was fair. So, he set the plates by the basin. I'm going to show you. Every day, for as long as it takes. Not because you owe me anything for it, and not because I expect it to change your mind quickly. He finally looked at her. Just because it's true and because you deserve someone who acts on it. Nora stood slowly. Her voice was careful. And if I can't believe you, then I'll keep showing you until you can. Or until you tell me to stop. She looked at him for a long time across the table. Okay, she said at last, very quietly. You can try, but Colt, her voice gained an edge of steel. If you're going to do this, you have to mean it all the way. Not half a truth, not effort that fades when the difficulty comes. I cannot survive another half-truth. No half-truths, Colt said. Just me trying my damnedest not to ruin it. Something small and fragile moved across Nora's face. Something that might have been the first careful edge of hope. All right, she said, and then you burned the cornbread. Significantly. I noticed. She almost smiled. Thank you for making it anyway. They washed up together without another word, and the silence between them was different than before. Not a barrier, but a space they were both moving carefully through. That's him. He kept his word. The next morning, he was downstairs, first the coffee already on when Nora came down. She paused at the foot of the stairs. Sleep all right, he asked. Well enough. She poured a cup and sat. Fine. He set eggs on the table. I'm riding to check the south water line after this. Should be back by noon if you need anything from town later. Nora looked at her coffee. You're telling me your plans? Figured you'd want to know where I am. She was quiet for a moment. Then all right, be careful out there. The south bank's been soft since the rain. It was a small thing, almost nothing, but something in her shoulders had released. Small steps, daily choices. He could do this. And 3 days later, he came home from town with a package wrapped in brown paper. Nora was at the table working through the farm accounts with a focused frown. She eyed the package with wary curiosity. What is that? Colt set it in front of her. Open it. She unwrapped it carefully the way a person does who isn't used to receiving things precise and hurried, like she wanted to preserve the wrapping paper. Inside was a book. Leather-bound gilt edges, the title pressed into the cover in clean type, Wuthering Heights. Nora stared at it. Mrs. Liang mentioned you'd been asking about it for months, Colt said. He moved toward the door, suddenly uncertain. Couldn't get it locally, so I sent a telegram to the bookseller in Dunmore. Had it shipped. This must have cost. Doesn't matter what it cost. Colt, we can't. I used my own money. What was left from before. He stopped at the doorway. You're always reading your mother's books. I thought you might want something new. Nora's hand moved slowly over the cover. Her fingers traced the embossed letters. Thank you, she said. Her voice had gone quiet and undefended. He nodded and left before his face could betray anything else. Behind him, barely audible, "You're making this very difficult." He was halfway across the yard before he realized he was smiling. Word spread the way it always does in a small town without anyone intending it and faster than anyone would believe. Within a week, Ember Flats had a new story. Saw him at the Mercantile buying wildflowers. Just because he said, no occasion. He helped fix the Widow Burke's porch. She's not even related to old Harlan. Did it for free because Nora mentioned it needed doing. He made her dinner. Burned the cornbread, something terrible, but he made it. The gossip had changed direction. The mockery hadn't disappeared entirely, but it had become uncertain the way ridicule always becomes uncertain when the person being ridiculed turns out to be something other than the story required. Edmund Voss heard the gossip too. Colt was driving a new corner post into the south fence line when Voss's black carriage rolled up the property road and stopped at the gate. Voss climbed down with the particular care of a man who doesn't like to get dirty, his coat brushed, and his expression already wearing the outcome. "Mr. Reardon?" He folded his hands behind his back. "A word." "Go ahead." Colt didn't put down the hammer. "I've been hearing interesting things about you and Mrs. Reardon." A pause. "About this marriage becoming genuine. That bother you?" "On the contrary," Voss smiled. "It fascinates me. I simply want to ensure you understand the full terms of our agreement." Colt drove another blow on the post. "Get to it." "The debt forgiveness is not permanent, Mr. Reardon. It's conditional on the marriage remaining legally valid for a minimum of 5 years. Should the marriage end through divorce annulment or any other legal dissolution, the debt reinstates in full with interest accumulated from the original date of the note." Colt's hammer stopped mid-swing. 5 years. "That wasn't explained to me," he said. His voice was controlled, barely. "It was in the contract. Clause 17 subsection B. A man should always read before he signs." Voss's smile had the quality of ice on a river, smooth and treacherous and deep. "Enjoy your domestic arrangement, Mr. Reardon. You have 4 years and 11 months remaining." The carriage rolled away. Colt stood with the hammer in his hand and the rage burning through him, clean and hot and useless, because the man's carriage was already 50 yards off and there wasn't a thing he could do about it. He drove 3 more posts before he trusted himself to walk back to the house. He didn't tell Nora. That was his first mistake. He carried the knowledge of the 5-year clause through 4 days of the regular pattern, morning coffee, shared work supper, the careful daily architecture he'd been building between them. It ate at him from the inside because he knew what Nora would make of it. He knew because he understood her now. She would hear 5 years and think he has to stay. All of this, every gesture, every book, every burned cornbread, it's self-preservation. He's protecting his investment. And he couldn't tell her she was wrong without telling her what Voss had said, which meant telling her he'd known for 4 days and hadn't said anything, which was its own kind of lie. So he worked harder instead. He drove himself until his hands bled and the fields were straighter and the water channels were clear and the farm was in better shape than it had been in years. He told himself he was proving things. He was mostly trying to outrun what he knew was coming. Nora noticed. On the 3rd day of the self-punishment schedule, she found him by the barn at dusk, still working, and she stood 10 feet away with her arms folded and her expression doing the thing it did when she was more worried than she was letting on. "Colt, almost done? You've been going since before sunup. You haven't eaten since breakfast." "I'm fine. Stop." Her voice was quiet, but it had the quality of something that wouldn't be argued with. He stopped. Set down the post driver. She waited until he turned around. "What's wrong?" He looked at her, and the lie he'd been maintaining cracked straight through. "Voss came by," he said. He told her everything. All of it. The 5-year clause, the timing, the way Voss had smiled when he said it. He watched her face while he talked, watching the understanding move through it in stages, surprise, then calculation, then the particular look she got when she was keeping herself very still to prevent something worse. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. 5 years, she said finally. "Yes. And you've known for 4 days." "Yes." She turned and walked toward the house. He followed. "Nora, I need a minute." She stopped at the porch steps with her back to him. "I need a minute to think through what this means." He gave it to her. When she finally turned around, her face was composed in a way that cost her something. "You're trapped here." That's exactly what it is." Her voice was precise, not bitter, precise. "Whatever you feel, whatever you've been building toward, you're also legally bound to stay, which means I can never fully know which one it is." She met his eyes. Do you understand why that matters? Not as an accusation, just can you see why that changes things for me? Yes, he said, I can. She sat down on the porch steps. After a moment, he sat beside her. I'm not going to tell you it doesn't complicate this, he said. It does. I know it does. He looked at his hands. But I need you to hear me when I say that if the only thing keeping me here were that contract, I'd do the minimum. I'd stay out of your way. I'd manage the legal requirement and keep my distance. He turned to face her. That's not what I'm doing. Nora was quiet. The 5 years will end, he said, and when they do, I'll still be here. Not because of a clause or a debt, because by then I'll have proven it in the only way that counts. He paused. But you can't know that yet, and I understand if you can't trust it yet. She looked at him for a long moment. You're asking me to wait 5 years to know if this is real? I'm asking you to watch, not to decide, not to commit to anything, just watch. He held her gaze. And let me keep trying. The evening had gone purple and still around them. A nighthawk circled somewhere above the tree line. I can't promise I'll believe it, Nora said at last. I'm not asking for promises, just don't close the door yet. She looked out across the field she'd spent her whole life protecting. All right, she said, I won't close the door. It wasn't everything, but it wasn't nothing, and right now, with Voss's 5-year gambit sitting between them, not nothing was the best he could hope for. When? That night, she called him back to the house after he'd already started for the barn out of habit. Pot roast, she said from the doorway. It's getting cold. He turned. She was standing in the lamplight with her arms folded and the careful composure she wore like armor, and underneath it, very faint, very guarded, something that wasn't quite open but wasn't closed either. Your favorite, she added. I noticed you always take thirds. He came back. They ate the pot roast at the kitchen table, and Nora talked about the farm accounts and what she thought the spring calving might bring, and Colt talked about the water lines in the south pasture, and neither of them said anything about 5 years, or Edmund Voss, or the particular kind of hoping that costs more than you have. But when she reached past him for the bread, and her hand accidentally brushed his, she didn't pull away. She just left it there for a moment before pulling back. It was a small thing. Everything true started small. 2 weeks passed. The equilibrium held uneasy and watchful but holding. Cole continued his daily arithmetic of small choices, the coffee, the fence work, the occasional dinner that came out better than before. Nora accepted them without ceremony, neither dismissing them nor building too much onto them. They were in the space of waiting, and they both knew it. Then Deke Salter made his final mistake. It was market day. Nora had ridden into town early to sell eggs and pick up a few necessities, and Colt had stayed back to finish the pasture gate he'd been rebuilding from scratch. He was driving the last pin when he heard hoofbeats coming fast from the road. Clara Holt pulled up in a hard lather, her face flushed and set. Get your horse, she said, now. He didn't ask. He saddled and rode. He heard them before he saw them. Deke's voice carrying across the street with the particular confidence of a man who has an audience and knows it. Nothing but a business arrangement. You bought yourself a husband with your daddy's land, and a bought man isn't a real one. The crowd had formed a loose ring in front of the general store. Nora stood with her back against the wall and her chin level and her eyes direct, and Deke was 3 feet from her with 2 of his habitual satellites flanking him, and every person in that ring was watching to see what would happen next. The whole town knows, Deke said louder, enjoying the audience. Reardon's been playing house for 2 months, and as soon as the legal window clears, he'll be... Colt's fist connected with Deke's jaw, and the rest of the sentence never happened. Deke went down into the dust hard, sat up blinking, touched his face. Get up, Colt said. Deke stayed down. The crowd had gone entirely silent. Colt, Nora's voice behind him, low and steady. Don't. He turned. She was looking at him with something that wasn't fear and wasn't anger. It was something careful, and it was asking him something he didn't fully understand yet. He was saying things about you, Colt said. I know. She took 1 step toward him. I've been hearing things like that my whole life. Hitting him won't stop it. Then what will... The truth. Her eyes held his. If you want to stop it, tell them the truth. All of it. Including the parts that don't make you look good. The crowd waited. Colt looked at Nora for a long moment. Then he turned to face the street. You want to know why I married her? His voice carried clean and flat. Not a shout, just a voice in a quiet place. Because I was drowning, and Edmund Voss threw me a rope with conditions. I married Nora Whitfield because I needed her land to save my skin. That's the truth. He heard the murmur move through the crowd. I'm telling you that because she asked me to be honest. Because she spent 32 years having people pretend things at her that weren't real, and she deserves at least one person who won't do that. Deke was still on the ground watching. Colt turned to Nora. What I didn't know when I signed those papers, he said, and now his voice was only for her, was who I was marrying. I didn't know I was marrying the strongest person in this county. I didn't know I was marrying a woman who feeds her neighbors and reads by candlelight and fixes fences at 5 in the morning and still has enough left over to make something like hope feel possible again. He held her gaze. I married her for the wrong reasons. And every day since then, I've been trying to become a man who deserves the right ones. The silence was absolute. Then someone clapped. Then someone else. It moved through the crowd, slowly at first, then with something like conviction. Nora was looking at him with an expression he had never seen on her face before. Not the careful composure, not the guarded patience, something open, something terrified, something luminous. Let's go home, he said quietly. She took his hand. They walked to the wagon through a street that had gone still and watchful, and for the first time respectful. They were a mile from home when Nora finally spoke. You didn't have to do that, she said. I know. Colt kept his eyes on the road ahead. But you asked for truth, and I gave you half of it every time. That back there was the full amount. You told them about the debt, about Voss's arrangement. She turned to face him. You didn't have to humiliate yourself in front of the whole town. I wasn't humiliated, I was honest. He glanced at her. There's a difference, though I'll admit I've had trouble locating it most of my life. Nora was quiet for a moment. Did you mean it, what you said about becoming a man who deserves the right reasons? He pulled the wagon to a stop. The horses settled. The road stretched empty ahead and behind the sagebrush, gray-green in the late afternoon light. I meant every word, he said. I can tell you when I started realizing it too. It wasn't grand. It was the second week when you were leaving for Clara's with that basket and her little boy ran out and hugged you before you could get to the wagon. You smiled, really smiled, not the careful one you use around me, and I thought this is who she is when she's not bracing herself. He paused. And then I thought she's been bracing herself around me from the day we met because I gave her every reason to, and I didn't want to be that reason anymore. The words settled between them. Nora's hands were in her lap still. The evening light caught the angle of her face, and Colt thought that the people who'd spent decades calling her plain had not been looking at her at all. I'm afraid, she said, I need you to know that, not of you specifically, of this, of believing in something and having it come apart. I know, I've done it before, believing someone meant what they said. She looked at him steadily. It doesn't get easier the more times you're wrong. No, he agreed, it doesn't. She turned and looked out at the fields rolling away toward the line of cottonwoods along the creek. Her father's cottonwoods planted one spring when they were saplings that barely reached his knee. What do you want from this, Colt? Not what you think you should say. What do you actually want? He thought about it seriously. I want to wake up on this land in 10 years and know that I built something real, he said. I want to still be here when those cottonwoods get their second growth. I want to eat terrible cornbread that I made myself and hear you tell me politely that it's not terrible when we both know it is. He looked at her. I want whatever comes next with you. Not as a transaction, not as a performance, as the person who somehow became my wife when I wasn't paying close enough attention. Nora's eyes had gone wet. That's a very long answer, she said. You asked what I actually wanted. She looked down at her lap. I can try, she said finally. I can try to believe you. I can't promise I won't be afraid the whole time. I'm not asking for fearless, he said. I'm asking for trying. She looked up, and for the first time she leaned toward him just slightly, just a few inches, and let herself rest against his shoulder. He didn't move. Didn't push the moment anywhere, just let her rest there. They sat like that for a longer time, the horses patient, and the evening cooling around them, neither of them needing to speak. Eventually, Nora sat up straight, pressed her palms flat on her thighs, and looked forward at the road. We should get home, she said. I left something simmering on the stove. Right. He picked up the reins, the horses moved, the wheels turned. But just before the farmhouse came into view, Nora reached over without looking at him and put her hand over his on the reins. She didn't say anything. She just left it there. Colt didn't say anything either. Some things are too new and too necessary for words. Then, the next day and the day after that, the pattern held. Morning coffee, work, supper. The slow, deliberate architecture of two people learning to trust their own proximity. Then 12 days after the scene in Ember Flats, the sound of hoofbeats came up the drive, And this time there were more of them than Voss would need. Marshal Frank Odom rode in front badge, catching the last of the afternoon sun, his expression that of a man who doesn't enjoy the errand he's been given. Behind him rode a clerk with a writing case, and in a separate carriage, Edmund Voss, still immaculate, still cold, wearing the particular expression of a man who has been waiting a long time to collect something. Colt came out of the barn. Nora came off the porch. "Mr. and Mrs. Reardon," the marshal said. "I apologize for the intrusion. I'm Marshal Frank Odom. I've been asked to look into the nature of your marriage, specifically whether it satisfies the legal requirements of the late Mr. Whitfield's will." Nora's face went very still. Colt stepped forward. "On whose authority?" Odom glanced toward Voss. "A formal complaint has been filed. Multiple witnesses have testified that this marriage was entered into as a purely transactional arrangement. If that's true, the will's requirements aren't satisfied, and the land stays with my wife." Colt's voice was flat. "Whatever those witnesses told you, I'm not here to take the land, Mr. Reardon. I'm here to determine facts." Odom's voice was not unkind. "I'll need to speak with you both separately, your wife first if she's willing." Nora looked at Colt. Something passed between them, not a plan, not a signal, just a moment of recognition. "I'll speak with the marshal," she said. Her voice was steady. "I have nothing to hide." She turned and walked inside. Marshal Odom and the clerk followed. Colt stood in the yard, watching the door close, his fists at his sides. Voss approached from the carriage unhurried. "Difficult position to be in," he said conversationally. "You set this up," Colt said, "from the beginning. You pushed her father to sell, he refused, so you waited for him to die, manufactured a situation you could blow up when it suited you." Voss didn't blink. "I protect the bank's interests. You arranged a marriage between two people you knew were vulnerable, and you built in the exact conditions to blow it apart." Colt kept his voice low. "That's not banking. That's something else. Call it what you like." Voss folded his hands behind his back. "The law will call it a legitimate investigation. The law," Colt said quietly, "is going to look very carefully at that arrangement once we have the right attorney asking the right questions." Voss's composure held, but something moved behind his eyes. "Is that a threat?" "It's a statement of intent." Colt looked toward the house. "You picked the wrong two people to manipulate Mr. Voss. You picked a woman who's been surviving people like you for 32 years. And you picked a man who's got nothing left to lose, except her." He met Voss's eyes. That combination tends to be hard to beat. Inside the house, Nora sat across from Marshal Odom and answered every question with the precision of a woman who has learned to choose her words like ammunition. "Was the marriage arranged for financial purposes?" Yes, that was true, and she said it without flinching. "Was it entered into in good faith?" That was more complicated. She'd needed a husband to keep her land. Colt had needed debt relief. Those were the reasons they'd stood in front of the minister. But good faith, she told Odom carefully, wasn't about the reasons that brought two people together. It was about what those people did with the marriage after. "And what had they done?" The clerk's pencil scratched steadily. "They'd built something real," she said. "Not because the law required it. Not because anyone was watching. Because it had become real quietly, stubbornly, the way anything real tends to become, without fanfare and without announcement." "Do you love him?" Odom asked. Nora was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. And it was the first time she'd said it anywhere but the private architecture of her own heart, and it landed with the weight of something that had been waiting a long time to be true. Odom studied her. "He loves you." "I'm starting to believe that." She met the marshal's eyes. "It's taken me a while." When she came back out, Odom gestured Colt inside. Nora stood on the porch watching Voss's carriage, her arms folded, her expression the same one she'd worn at the church, straight-backed, immovable, enduring. She had been here before. Standing in the fire and not burning. She was still standing. Inside the house, Colt sat across from Marshal Odom. The room felt smaller than it had that morning. The clerk's pencil poised Odom's steady gaze across the table in the particular quiet of a house waiting to find out its fate. "Let's be direct," Odom said. "Why did you marry Nora Whitfield?" "To erase a debt." Odom's eyebrows rose slightly. He'd clearly expected some version of protest. "You're not going to deny it. What's the point? The whole town knows. Lying about it now would only make everything else look like a lie, too." Colt held Odom's gaze. "The marriage was practical. It started that way. I won't pretend otherwise." "So you admit the original intent was transactional?" "I admit the original intent was survival." He leaned forward slightly. "She needed a husband to keep her father's land. I needed debt forgiveness. We both signed in because the alternative was losing everything. That's the transaction. He paused. What happened after that's something else. What happened after? Colt thought about the fence line in the early morning, the candle in the kitchen window, the book that had cost him a week's worth of what little money he had left, the way she'd leaned against his shoulder on the road home and not said anything because she hadn't needed to. I started paying attention, he said, to who she actually is, not what this town has decided she is. He looked at the table. She wakes before dawn to take care of everyone around her. She feeds people who've spent years mocking her. She kept that farm alive through 15 years of grief and isolation, and she did it alone, and the town turned that into a joke. His voice had gone harder. The joke was on the town. She's the most capable person in Ember Flats, and she's been carrying the weight of it without acknowledgement since she was 17 years old. Odom said nothing. The clerk wrote, "When did you realize your feelings had changed?" the marshal asked. "Gradually." Colt turned his hat in his hands. "I can't give you a date. I can tell you it was before any of this, before the complaint, before you showed up today. It was in the middle of ordinary days. That's usually when true things happen. I've been told you slept in the barn initially." "I did. And now, the guest room." He met Odom's eyes. "I moved in when she offered. Separately. We've been careful with each other because she deserved to have a say in how this developed." He paused. "That isn't the behavior of a man running a con. A man running a con does the minimum required. He doesn't learn how she takes her coffee. He doesn't read the letter from the field hand about the south water line twice because he wants to understand the land she loves." He looked at Odom steadily. "I have been trying genuinely without an audience most of the time because she matters to me, not because of a contract." Odom sat back. He looked like a man reassessing something. "Mr. Reardon," he said at last, "I'm going to be straightforward with you. Edmund Voss has considerable influence in this county. He will bring witnesses, documentation, his own attorney. He's going to make the argument that your marriage is fraudulent from foundation to roof." He paused. "If you're going to fight this, you need your own attorney, your own witnesses, and anything concrete that might explain his motivation for targeting this property specifically." Colt stood. "Then that's what we'll find." Odom rose too. He picked up his hat. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "I believe you, both of you." He looked toward the window, toward the yard where Nora was still standing on the porch. "But the law doesn't run on belief. It runs on evidence. Get me something I can work with." He walked out. Colt stood for a moment in the kitchen where she made pot roast from memory and set two places at the table even in the earliest days when they barely spoke, and he thought about how it felt to have something worth fighting for. Then he went out to tell Nora what they needed to do next. Marshal Odom's horses were barely out of earshot before Colt was telling Nora what the marshal had said. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet she used when she was working something through rather than retreating from it. "We need James Pryor," she said. "The attorney. His reputation is for cases that look unwinnable. He's taken on the Railroad Commission twice and the county assessor once. Lost one too." She turned and went inside. "I'll send a telegram in the morning. I can ride to Dunmore tonight if... Tomorrow's fine, dearest." She was already at the writing desk pulling out paper. "Tonight we figure out what we have." Colt watched her settle into focus the way she always did, not frantic, not frightened, just systematically present. He moved to the table. "What do you mean, what we have? Evidence? Anything Voss doesn't want a court to see." She looked up. "He's been trying to acquire this land for years. If he was willing to manufacture a marriage to get to it, there's a paper trail. There almost always is with men like him. They document everything because they believe that documentation protects them. Where do we start?" "My father's papers." "What the?" They spent the rest of the evening at the kitchen table with 3 years of Whitfield farm records spread across every flat surface. Tax documents, land surveys, correspondence, bank notices, receipts. Colt sorted, Nora read. The lamp burned low and they refilled it without comment, neither of them willing to stop. Around midnight, Nora found it. "Colt." He looked up. She was holding a letter, both hands, and her face had gone the color of candle wax. "This is from Voss." Her voice was controlled, but barely. "Dated 4 months before my father died." Colt moved around the table. She held the letter so they could both read it. It was a purchase offer, formal typewritten, Edmund Voss's signature at the bottom. The offered price was less than half the land's assessed value. At the bottom, in a postscript that wore the costume of professional courtesy and contained a threat so clean it could cut, I advise you to consider this offer carefully. Mr. Whitfield, properties along the proposed Southern Railroad corridor have a narrow window of optimal valuation. Those who wait too long may find the market has moved past them entirely. He knew about the railroad, Nora said. He knew, and he didn't tell your father the real value. He tried to scare him into selling cheap. Her voice had gone flat in the way it went when anger found its most controlled form. And when my father refused, he waited. Colt took the letter, read it again. He waited for your father to then set the whole thing in motion. The debt he used to pull me in the marriage clause, the 5-year trap he built it, knowing he could challenge it later. Nora sat down. Her hands flat on the table were very still. He was never trying to enforce the will's marriage requirement, she said. He was manufacturing grounds to claim the marriage was fraudulent. He needed us to fail. So the investigation wasn't about the law. It was about the railroad. The proposed Southern route runs directly through the lower 40 acres. She looked up at Colt. Whoever owns this land, when that road is finalized, the right-of-way fees alone would be worth more than the farm has ever earned in a decade. Colt set the letter down carefully. This changes everything. If we can convince a court it's relevant. Nora's voice was precise. Pryor needs to see this first thing tomorrow. First thing tomorrow, Colt agreed. He picked up the lamp and set it closer to the letter, and they sat together reading it a third time, looking for every implication, every angle, every crack in Voss's carefully constructed house of paper and patience. James Pryor arrived from Dunmore 2 days later. He was younger than Colt had expected, late 30s, lean, with the kind of face that stayed neutral at the moments when other people's faces betrayed them. He read the letter from Voss without apparent emotion, then read it again. "Where did you find this?" he asked. "Bottom drawer of my father's desk," Nora said. "I hadn't gone through his papers thoroughly until last week." "Does Voss know this letter exists?" "He sent it, so presumably he knows he wrote it. Whether he knows we have it." Nora paused. "No way to be certain." Pryor set the letter down. "It establishes motive. That's significant." He looked between them. But motive isn't enough on its own. We need to show the court that Voss structured your marriage specifically to create grounds for challenge. The letter shows he wanted the land. We need to show the court how the marriage arrangement was designed to fail." He turned to Colt. "Walk me through the debt. How did it originate? How did Voss approach you? Exactly what terms were discussed verbally versus what appeared in the contract?" Colt talked for an hour. Pryor took notes with a focused stillness, interrupting occasionally to clarify a detail. By the end, he had 3 pages and an expression that suggested he was beginning to enjoy himself, in the way that good lawyers do when the case starts to cohere. "The 5-year clause is the key," Pryor said. "It's in the contract, but it wasn't explained to you verbally. Voss rushed the signing." He tapped his pen. "That's the pattern. Rush the signing, leave the problematic terms unexplained, create a situation he can challenge at a moment of his choosing." He looked at Nora. His ideal scenario was probably to let the marriage limp along for 6 months, then hit you with the investigation once you were established enough that the challenge would be plausible, but early enough that you hadn't built sufficient evidence of a genuine union. "He waited too long," Nora said quietly. Pryor allowed himself a small smile. "He did. You two appear to have been inconveniently sincere. He requested the court subpoena Voss's records, all of them. Every document related to the Whitfield land, the debt arrangement, the marriage agreement correspondence with the marshal's office. He filed the motions that afternoon. When he left, Colt and Nora stood on the porch watching his horse disappear down the road. "He's good," Colt said. "He's careful." Nora turned toward the house. "There's a difference." And the week before the hearing was the longest of Colt's life. He worked the farm with the kind of intensity that has nothing to do with productivity. It was the work of a man who doesn't know how to be still when something important is out of his hands. He rebuilt the chicken coop. He cleared the irrigation channel on the north end. He remortared the section of the house foundation that had been cracking since the spring thaw. Nora watched him without comment for 3 days. On the 4th, she came to find him behind the barn, where he was wrestling with a fence post that had rotted at the base. "You're going to hurt yourself," she said. "I'm fine." "You've been fine for 4 days straight. That's a lot of fine." She crossed her arms. "Come in. I want to show you something." She led him into the front room and pointed at the chair by the window, the chair where she sat to read in the evenings. On the side table, her mother's recipe book, her copy of Wuthering Heights 2/3 through now. and beside them a folded piece of paper. "I found this in my father's Bible this morning," she said. He unfolded it. A letter in an older man's handwriting, labored but clear, the hand of someone who wrote carefully because he didn't write often. "For whoever helps my Nora keep this land, she won't ask for help because she never has. She won't say she's frightened because she doesn't allow herself that. But she is underneath the capable part. She's always been. Her mother was the same way. You have to look carefully. Take care of her, not because she can't take care of herself. She can better than most, but because everyone deserves someone who tries." Thomas Whitfield. Colt read it twice. His throat did something he didn't invite. "He must have written it after Voss's visit," Nora said, when he realized he might not win. She took the letter back gently. "He knew something might happen to the farm. He was trying to make sure—" She stopped. "He was trying to make sure I'd be all right." "You found a man who tries," Colt said. Nora folded the letter. "So it seems." She looked at him steadily. "I know the odds at the hearing. Voss has money and influence and professional witnesses. We have a letter with motive and a handful of neighbors willing to speak. And Pryor." "And Pryor." She nodded. "But I need to say this before the hearing in case there's no good time after." She looked at him directly. "Whatever happens, I don't regret this. Any of it. I don't regret the marriage or the barn room or the terrible cornbread or any of the slow and difficult months between the start and now." She paused. "I just wanted you to know." Colt moved across the room to her. Not dramatic, just deliberate. He cupped her face in both hands, the way he might handle something that mattered. "Whatever happens," he said, "you're not doing it alone." She closed her eyes for a moment, leaned into it. Then, "We should probably eat something. It's almost supper." "Right. And you smell like 3 hours of fence work." "That's fair." She almost laughed, that real laugh, the one she didn't guard. He went to clean up, and when he came back downstairs, she had set 2 places at the table with the good plates, the ones she kept for Sunday, and there was pot roast on the stove, and bread in the cloth, and something that felt in that lamp-lit kitchen at the eve of the most important week of their lives, unmistakably like home. The night before the hearing, Nora couldn't sleep. Colt heard her moving around downstairs around 2 in the morning. He lay still for a few minutes, staring at the ceiling, then got up. She was in the kitchen, not cooking, not reading, just sitting at the table with her hands around a cold cup of tea, staring at the middle distance. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. She looked up. "I woke you." "I was awake." He leaned back. "Say what's on your mind." She turned the cup slowly. "If Voss wins tomorrow, if the court finds the marriage fraudulent, the land goes to the bank, which means it goes to Voss." She paused. "And you're freed from the debt because the debt forgiveness was contingent on the marriage occurring, not on it lasting. It survives the annulment." "You're telling me I'd walk away clean?" "You'd walk away clean," she confirmed. Colt was quiet. "That's what you've been sitting here calculating," he said, in the middle of the night. "I want to be honest with you." She looked up. "If we lose, you have no reason to stay. And I think you should know that before tomorrow. And if I tell you the reason to stay is you, then I'd tell you that's—" She stopped. Her voice had gone careful. "That's what I want to believe. And because I want to believe it so badly is exactly why I can't afford to just accept it." Colt leaned forward on his elbows. "Nora, look at me." She looked. "I'm not leaving." He said it the way you say a thing when you're done with the version where it's complicated. "Win or lose tomorrow, I'm not leaving. If we keep the land, we build on it together. If we lose the land, we start somewhere else together. I would like very much for us to keep the land because it's yours and it was your father's and your mother is buried under the cottonwoods and those things matter." He held her gaze. "But the farm isn't the reason I'm staying. You are." Nora looked at him for a long time. Then carefully she reached across the table and took his hand. "Okay," she said. "Okay, you believe me, or okay, you're still weighing it?" She almost smiled. "Okay, I'm choosing to believe you. There's a difference." "There is," he agreed, "and I'll take it." They sat in the quiet kitchen until the first gray light started at the window, his hand warm over hers, neither of them needing to fill the silence with anything. "Listen." The Ember Flats courthouse had not seen a crowd like this since the water rights dispute of 1881. People had come from 3 counties. Ranchers, townspeople, farmers, the inevitable contingent of the simply curious. The gallery was packed chest to back. Voss sat at the plaintiff's table with 2 city attorneys, both visibly expensive. Pryor sat alone at the defense table with his 3 pages of notes in the Voss letter, in the particular calm of a man who has identified exactly where the other side's argument is hollow. Colt and Nora came in together. The whispers started immediately, but Colt noticed they had a different quality than usual, less mockery, more attention. What had happened in front of the general store had traveled through Ember Flats and kept going. People had heard what he'd said about Nora in the open street. Some of them had reconsidered some things. Judge Celia Hargrove took the bench. She was 60, compact, and had the expression of a woman who has heard every variety of foolishness a courtroom can produce and been impressed by very little of it. This is a hearing to determine the validity of the marriage between Colt Reardon and Nora Whitfield Reardon, she said. Mr. Voss, your petition. Counsel, proceed. Voss's lead attorney, a tall man named Fitch from the Dunmore office, was smooth and methodical. He called 3 witnesses who testified to the arrangement's transactional origins. Each one was technically accurate. Colt and Nora had married for practical reasons. Everyone in Ember Flats knew it. The witnesses said so clearly and without embellishment. Pryor cross-examined each one with polite thoroughness, establishing in each case that the witness's knowledge was limited to the first weeks of the marriage, and that none of them had direct observation of the relationship in its current state. The picture he built question by patient question was of testimony assembled from early impressions and not updated since. Then he called his own witnesses. Clara Holt went first. She described the food deliveries not as charity, but as relationship, as sustained care that had been going on for years before Colt arrived. She described the Wednesday baskets, the Sunday bread, the practical help given without accounting or expectation. Then she described what she'd observed between Colt and Nora, the way he'd moved when Deke Salter mentioned her name, the way he'd stood in the street and told the truth at cost to himself. That's not a man performing a marriage, Clara said. That's a man who's fallen in love with his wife. Old Harlan Burke followed. Mrs. Liang, Ruth Daly from the school. One after another, they described a woman who had carried this town in invisible ways for years, and a man who had learned to see it when the rest of them hadn't. Fitch objected to the relevance repeatedly. Hargrove overruled him just as often. Then Pryor stood. Your Honor, I'd like to submit new evidence. A letter written by Edmund Voss to the late Thomas Whitfield dated 4 months before Mr. Whitfield's death. The courtroom shifted. Voss at the plaintiff's table went very still. Pryor read the letter into the record. The purchase offer, the below-market price, the postscript about the railroad corridor that sounded like advice and was a threat. This letter, Pryor said, establishes that Mr. Voss has been attempting to acquire this property for years, that he was aware of its dramatically elevated value due to the proposed railroad route, and that he concealed that value from the landowner in an attempt to purchase the property cheaply. When Mr. Whitfield refused, Voss waited for his death and then manufactured the conditions of this marriage specifically to create grounds for challenge at a moment of his choosing. He looked at Judge Hargrove. I'd like to call Mr. Voss to the stand. Edmund Voss crossed to the courtroom with the careful gait of a man who has not yet decided whether to be alarmed. He was sworn in and seated. Pryor approached without hurry. Mr. Voss, you are the primary investor in the Ember Flats Savings and Trust, 60% ownership, correct? Correct. And you are the individual who offered debt relief to Colt Reardon in exchange for his marriage to Nora Whitfield. I facilitated an arrangement that satisfied obligations on multiple sides. Yes. Did you explain the 5-year conditionality clause to Mr. Reardon verbally prior to signing? A pause. It was in the contract. Did you explain it verbally? I expected him to read the contract. Did you explain it verbally, Mr. Voss? No. A ripple through the gallery. Hargrove's gavel landed once lightly. Pryor walked to the plaintiff's table and picked up the letter. This letter, entered into evidence as Exhibit C, was sent by you to Thomas Whitfield 4 months before his death. You offered below-market value for this property while knowing the railroad corridor would dramatically increase its worth. Mr. Whitfield refused. I made a legitimate business offer. Did you inform Mr. Whitfield of the railroad corridor's probable route? Voss said nothing. The corridor would run through the lower 40 acres of the Whitfield property. Whoever owns that land when the route is finalized stands to negotiate right-of-way fees that exceed the farm's current annual value many times over. Were you aware of this when you made your offer? I was aware there were proposals being considered. Were you aware, Pryor repeated, that the southern corridor was the preferred route and that it ran through this specific property? Fitch was on his feet. Objection? Speculative. Goes to motive, Your Honor, Pryor said evenly. Hargrove looked at Voss over her glasses. Answer the question. Another long pause. I had information about probable routes, yes. The courtroom went quiet in a particular way, the quiet of people understanding something at the same moment. Pryor set the letter down. Mr. Voss, Did you structure the marriage arrangement between Colt Reardon and Nora Whitfield with the knowledge that it could be challenged? I structured an arrangement that was legally defensible. Did you structure it with the specific intent of creating grounds for challenge later, should the marriage inconveniently become genuine? Fitch objected. Hargrove let the question stand. Voss looked at Pryor, then at Hargrove, then for just a fraction of a second at Nora, and in that fraction something moved across his face that was not quite shame and was not quite satisfaction and was very much the expression of a man who has been outmaneuvered. I acted in the bank's interests, Voss said. That is not an answer to my question. Silence. Mr. Voss, Hargrove said, answer counsel's question. Did you structure this arrangement knowing it could be challenged? The answer that finally came out was barely louder than the scrape of a chair. Yes. The gallery erupted. Hargrove's gavel hit 3 times before order resumed. Pryor turned back to the defense table, his expression giving away nothing except a faint quality of completeness. He didn't ask another question. He didn't need to. Judge Hargrove requested 15 minutes to review the submitted evidence before ruling. She took 40, which Colt spent standing by the window at the back of the courtroom, with Nora's hand in both of his, not speaking, not needing to. Clara Holt found them near the window. You all right? She asked Nora. Yes? Nora's voice was steady. She meant it. Pryor was extraordinary. He was, Nora agreed. He found the right question. The question was already there, Pryor said, appearing at Colt's shoulder. Voss's structure had one weak point. He needed to testify before a judge who would ask him directly, and he was accustomed to rooms where people didn't. He glanced toward the bench. He should not have gotten on that stand. Why did he? Because his attorneys told him he had to look confident. Pryor's mouth curved very slightly. Confidence and honesty are not the same quality. When Hargrove returned to the bench, the room held its breath. I've heard enough, she said. I'll be direct. She had been reviewing the evidence and testimony not to evaluate whether Colt and Nora had entered their marriage for purely romantic reasons, because that was not and had never been the legal standard. The standard was good faith. The standard was intent to create a lasting union. On that question, Hargrove said, the testimony is clear. This marriage was entered into under duress, partially manufactured by the petitioner. Mr. Voss was not acting as a disinterested enforcer of the law. He was acting as a party with substantial financial interest in the outcome, who structured an arrangement he intended to exploit. She looked at Voss's table. That is not a legitimate challenge to a marriage. That is fraud. She turned to Colt and Nora. As to whether this marriage became genuine, the evidence speaks for itself. This court finds for the defendants. The marriage between Colt Reardon and Nora Whitfield Reardon is valid. The Whitfield land remains in Mrs. Reardon's name, free from any claim arising from today's petition. She looked at Voss over her glasses. Furthermore, I am referring this matter to the Territorial Prosecutor's Office for investigation into fraudulent banking practices and the manipulation of probate proceedings. You will want to retain new counsel, Mr. Voss, counsel that is better at knowing when not to let their client take the stand. The gavel came down. The gallery came up. Nora made a sound that Colt had never heard from her. Not quite a laugh, not quite a sob, something between the two that happens when something held in too long finally releases. He pulled her in and held on. Around them, people were on their feet. Somewhere in the back, someone was clapping. It spread. Clara Holt was crying. Old Harlan Burke was shaking Pryor's hand and saying something Colt couldn't hear. Mrs. Liang had her arms around Nora, and Ruth Daly was there, and a half dozen others who had come to testify or to witness, or simply because this was the town they lived in, and some things mattered enough to show up for. At the plaintiff's table, Voss sat very still. His attorneys were already packing their cases. Fitch said something to him, and Voss didn't respond. He just sat there looking at the empty table in front of him. The architecture of a very long plan finally and completely collapsed. He left without looking back. Marshal Odom approached at last. He shook Colt's hand and nodded at Nora. I owe you both an apology, he said. I should have seen through his scheme earlier. You did your job, Nora said. I was used to do it. His jaw was tight. Different thing. He turned to go, then paused. For what it's worth, I've looked at a lot of marriages in a professional capacity. Looking for fraud, looking for legitimacy. It's not usually this obvious. He glanced between them. Anyone with eyes could see it in that room. The real thing always shows. He tipped his hat and walked out. They were halfway home before either of them spoke. The evening was cooling toward blue, the road winding through scrub and sage, and the particular open stillness of land that goes on past seeing. Colt held the reins loosely. Nora sat beside him on the bench, not leaning away, not holding herself apart. "It's over," she said finally. "It's over. We keep the land. We keep the land." She turned to look at him. "What do we do now?" It was the same question he'd asked her that first night over supper. What happens now? And she'd answered, "That depends on you." He'd thought about it differently then. The weight of it had been different. "Now we build it," he said, "the way we planned. Expand the pasture, get the horses going properly, maybe hire a second hand by spring." He paused. "Plant something along the south fence line, elms maybe. They'll be good-sized in 10 years. 10 years, she said. "I'm planning ahead." Nora was quiet, then Colt. "Yeah, what you said in the street, the day you hit Deke Salter." She looked at him steadily. "You said you married me for the wrong reasons, and you were staying for all the right ones." "I meant it. I know you meant it." She shifted to face him fully. "I want to say something back, because I've been thinking about it since that day, and I want to say it before I lose the nerve." He pulled the horses to a stop. The road was empty. The last light was going gold behind the hills. "I've spent most of my life deciding I was the sort of person things didn't happen to," Nora said. "Not the kind of love worth keeping. Not the kind of woman a man chooses when he doesn't have to." Her voice was steady, but just barely. "I decided that early, and I held on to it because it was easier than hoping for the other thing." She met his eyes. "You made it very difficult to hold on to." "Good," he said. "I love you," she said. "That's what I wanted to say. I have been gradually, stubbornly against every sensible instinct I possess, falling in love with you since approximately the second fence post." Her chin came up slightly, the familiar angle of a woman who has decided to say the true thing regardless of how exposed it leaves her. "I thought you should know." Colt looked at her for a moment. Then he leaned across the bench and kissed her. Not tentative, not brief, not the careful first kiss they'd managed on the road home from the market day. Full and present and certain, with the horses standing patient and the gold light going slowly, and nothing else requiring their attention for as long as they chose to give it. When they finally broke apart, Nora's expression was something he hadn't seen before, open all the way through, no armor, no guarding. "I love you too," he said. "In case the last 4 months haven't communicated that adequately." She laughed. "That real one unguarded. They communicated it. I was just slow to receive it." "Worth the wait," he said. She reached up and touched his face, her palm flat against his jaw, the gesture of a person who has decided to stop being afraid of what they want. "Take me home," she said. He picked up the reins. The horses moved. The wheels turned on the road home, their road, their land, their life, which had started in desperation and debt, in a borrowed dress that didn't fit, and had arrived somehow by the most indirect route imaginable at this two people choosing each other on a country road with the day going out around them. The farmhouse was dark when they arrived, the way it always was when they'd both been gone. No candle in the kitchen window tonight. But Nora lit one when they came inside, set it on the table, and the light it threw was familiar, in a way that had crept up on Colt without his noticing the particular pattern of shadows on the ceiling. The smell of the dried herbs she kept by the stove, the sound of the house settling around them. He knew this house now. He knew how it breathed. "I'll make tea," Nora said. "It's almost 10. "I know." She set this kettle on. "I won't sleep for hours anyway, the everything today." She turned. "You either, I imagine." He sat down at the table. "No." She moved through the kitchen with the ease of long practice, and Colt watched her and thought about Thomas Whitfield's letter. Take care of her, not because she can't take care of herself, she can better than most, but because everyone deserves someone who tries. "I found your father's letter," he said. "The one in the Bible. You showed it to me the other day." "I remember. He was right about you." Colt turned his hat in his hands, the capable part and the underneath part both. Nora set 2 cups on the table and sat across from him, the candle between them. He was a man who paid attention. She traced the rim of her cup. "He would have liked you, I think. He was suspicious of charm, but he had a lot of respect for people who showed up." "I showed up eventually." "You showed up when it mattered." She met his eyes. "That's the whole thing, really." The kettle whispered. She got up to pour, and Colt thought about all the evenings that had led here. The barn room, the narrow guest bed, the kitchen at midnight, the fence posts and Wednesday baskets and burned cornbread, and a leather-bound book that had cost him the last of his savings. All the small, daily patient architecture of choosing the same person over and over until it became the most natural thing in the world. He'd come here with nothing and somehow built a life he'd die for. They drank their tea in comfortable silence, the kind that doesn't need filling. Nora was half dozing over her cup by the time it was finished, the tension of the day finally releasing. "Go to sleep," he said. "In a minute." "Nora." She opened her eyes. "You're very bossy for a man who spent his first week sleeping in my barn." "I'm making up for lost time." She stood and he stood, and for a moment they were both just present in the kitchen that had become the center of their life together, the table where he'd learned her, the window where he'd first seen her lonely, the stove where they'd made 10,000 small things that added up to a home. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it, all the choosing." He put his hand to her face. "Thank you for making it worth choosing." She covered his hand with hers, held it there a moment. Then she went upstairs. He blew out the candle. Outside, the land lay quiet in the dark, the cottonwoods along the creek, the south pasture, the fence lines they'd repaired together. The ground her father had built, the ground she'd held, the ground they would now tend together for as long as the years allowed. Colt stood in the dark kitchen for a moment, listening to the house. Then he followed her up the stairs. 3 months after the hearing, Ember Flats had adjusted to the new version of the story. Towns are like that, they can hold contradictory narratives for a while, sustaining the old mockery alongside the new respect, running both until one of them wears out. In this case, the old narrative had worn out, first replaced by something that the town hadn't entirely planned for, but found it couldn't argue with evidence. Colt Reardon worked the Whitfield farm with a focused daily seriousness that people noticed because it was exactly the opposite of what they'd expected. The men he'd known from the saloon days watched him pass on the road and said nothing useful because the useful thing had stopped being clear. The women who'd whispered about Nora in pews and doorways found themselves in the awkward position of being publicly incorrect. Clara Holt's version of events had become the dominant one, which meant the version where Colt had stood in the main street and told the truth at his own expense. That story had weight. It traveled. The farm itself had begun to show what two capable people could build when they weren't spending energy on survival and defense. The spring planting had gone in early and clean. The south pasture gate, the one Colt had rebuilt from scratch the week before the hearing, now opened and closed with a precision that had not existed previously. 2 new fence lines ran true across the back 40. The bay mare that had been ruined by rough handling was now carrying light riders without incident, which in the horse world represented a minor miracle. And against the south fence line, 12 young elm saplings stood in a row, recently planted, their roots barely established. Colt had planted them the morning after the hearing. He hadn't said anything about it. Nora had seen them and walked the line counting them and come back inside without comment. But that evening at supper, she'd looked at him across the table with an expression that didn't need words. 10 years. He was planning ahead. With them, James Pryor sent a letter in March. The Territorial Prosecutor's Office had opened a formal investigation into Edmund Voss's banking practices. 3 other landowners in the county had come forward with similar accounts: purchase pressure, withheld information, arrangements engineered to fail. The pattern was wide enough to be systemic. Voss had not been seen in Ember Flats since the day of the hearing. His carriage had left town 2 hours after Judge Hargrove ruled, and no one had reported seeing him since. The Ember Flats Savings and Trust was operating under the scrutiny of a territorial receiver while the investigation proceeded. Pryor's letter was factual and brief. He did not editorialize. The postscript read, "The elms were a good idea." Colt read the letter twice and handed it to Nora and went out to check the irrigation line because there was always something to check. That spring brought rain in the right amounts at the right times. The kind of spring a farmer's whole year can turn on, and the planting came up strong. It also brought Clara Holt's eldest daughter, Rose, who had broken her leg in a riding accident and needed somewhere to recover while Clara managed the household. Nora had offered without hesitation. Rose was 17 and funny and self-contained, and she occupied the guest room for 6 weeks and spent most of her recovery time in the kitchen doorway learning to bake from Nora, which was considerably more useful than lying in bed. Colt found himself eating better than he had at any point in his adult life. Rose was a fast student. "You should charge for cooking lessons," he told Nora one evening after a supper that had involved 3 courses and actual dessert. "I should charge for a lot of things I give away," Nora said, which was both self-aware and not at all a complaint. Rose went home at the end of April, having mastered biscuits, pie crust, and the particular trick of handling the difficult mare that Nora had been refining for months. Clara came to collect her and stood in the Reardon kitchen doorway, looking at her daughter and then at Nora with an expression of profound gratitude. "She's taller," Clara said. "She's not taller," Nora said. "She just carries herself differently." Clara looked at Colt. "You've both done that," she said. "Both of you. The way this place feels now." She shook her head. Thomas would be proud. Nora looked at her cup. After Clara and Rose left, the house was quieter than it had been in weeks. Colt was washing up at the pump when Nora came out and stood in the yard looking at the elm saplings along the fence. "She's right," Nora said. "About what?" "That this place feels different." She turned. "It's not the repairs. It's not even the spring. She paused. "It's what it means when a house has two people who both want to be in it." He crossed the yard to stand beside her, and they looked at the farm together. The new fence lines, the garden that was already coming up along the north wall, the barn with its properly hung doors, the sapling elms in their neat row. "What does it mean?" he asked. "It means it's a home." She looked up at him. "I've been living in it for 32 years and calling it a home, but—" She stopped. "I think this is what it actually is." He put his arm around her, and she leaned into it the way she'd been leaning into things lately, without the half-second of restraint that had come before, without the particular care of a woman bracing herself. "Yeah," he said, "this is what it is." Summer came hard and bright and full of work. Colt hired a hand, a young man named Sam Decker from the far side of the county, quiet and reliable with cattle, who figured out quickly that this was a household where the wife knew more about farming than anyone on the property and didn't make it complicated for himself by pretending otherwise. They ran the operation through the long days with an efficiency that was different in quality from what Nora had managed alone, not because she'd been insufficient, but because two people thinking about the same problem from different angles find solutions that one person can't reach. The lower 40, the land that ran toward the creek and would eventually carry the railroad right of way, was producing particularly well. Colt had put winter wheat in there based on the soil composition, and the yield had come back strong enough to surprise even Nora. "You know what this means?" she said at the kitchen table over the ledger running the numbers. "We're doing well. We're doing very well." She set down the pen. "If the yield is consistent, if we keep the rail fee agreement, when the route is finalized, this land could support expansion. New pasture, a second barn." She looked at him. "Real expansion, not survival, growth." Colt leaned back in his chair. "When did you start thinking about growth instead of survival?" She considered. "Sometime in the spring, I think, around the time the elms went in." She met his eyes. "When I stopped needing to be ready for things to fall apart." He nodded slowly. "What does expansion look like to you?" "I'd like to run more horses. Breeding stock, not just working animals. Mrs. Liang mentioned a breeder up in Highfield who's been looking to place some quality broodmares." She paused. "And I'd like to fix the back room properly, not just functional properly, make it what it should have been when my father built it." "Why didn't he—" "He ran out of money before he ran out of plans." She closed the ledger. "It happens." "What room is it?" She pushed back from the table. "Come look." The back room was off the kitchen, past the pantry, barely 12 feet by 10 with a low ceiling and a single window that looked east. It had been used for storage for as long as Nora could remember. Old feed bags, broken tools, a wooden chest that hadn't been opened in years, the accumulated overflow of a farm that never quite caught up to itself. Nora stood in the doorway. "My mother wanted it to be a sitting room, somewhere you could read in the morning when the light comes from that window." She nodded at the east-facing glass. "She never got to use it that way." Colt looked at the room, then at Nora. "I can do that," he said. "It's not urgent." "I know." He turned back to the room. "But it should have been done a long time ago." He started on it the following week. It was careful work, the kind that has to go slowly because the old structure has to be understood before it can be improved. He reinforced the ceiling joists, cleared everything out, repaired the plaster, refinished the floorboards that were worth saving, and replaced the ones that weren't. Nora came to watch sometimes and didn't offer opinions, which he appreciated. She'd given him the room. The execution was his to figure out. The chest in the corner turned out to contain her mother's things. Fabric remnants, a set of china cups wrapped in old newspaper, a few books, and in a small cedar box, a brooch of deep amber glass set in silver that Nora held in her palm for a long time without speaking. "I forgot this existed," she said. "Put it on." She pinned it at the collar of her work shirt, wrong setting entirely, which somehow made it look exactly right. She wore it for the rest of the day. On the last Friday of July, without announcement, Deke Salter stopped Colt outside the feed store. Colt's hands tightened slightly on the grain sacks. It was involuntary. But Deke's posture was different than it had been in every previous encounter. No smirk, no audience arranged behind him. He was standing alone with his hat in his hands, which for Deke Salter was a significant change of configuration. "Got a minute," Deke said. "Maybe half of one." Deke looked at his hat. "I owe you an apology, and I owe your wife one more." He said it with the particular difficulty of a man who has been composing this sentence for weeks and is just now delivering it. "What I said outside the store and in the saloon, all of it, it wasn't right." Colt waited. "I heard about the hearing. What Pryor found out about Voss." Deke shifted. "And I heard what you said in the street. About her." He looked up. "I've been saying the same garbage about Nora Whitfield, Mrs. Reardon, since before I can remember. Because that's what we said. Because it was easy." He shook his head. "Doesn't make it right." Colt was quiet for a moment. "Then come tell her yourself." Deke looked startled. "What? You want to apologize? Come to the farm. Tell her directly. She's the one who's owed the words." Deke turned his hat over once. "She might not want to hear it." "Probably not." Colt picked up the grain sacks. "Come anyway. Next Sunday before noon. She won't turn you away." He loaded the wagon. He didn't look back. Deke showed up Sunday at 11. He stood on the porch with his hat in his hands again and said to Nora what he'd said to Colt, clumsy and inadequate, in the way apologies usually are when they arrive late, and Nora stood in the doorway and listened to all of it. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "All right," she said. "Thank you for coming." "That's all. What else is there?" She wasn't dismissive, just clear. "You said the truth. I heard it. We can move forward from here if you'd like." Deke blinked. He'd clearly anticipated something more difficult. You're not angry." "I was angry for a long time," Nora said. "I used up most of it years ago. What I have left, I'd rather spend on something that matters." She tilted her head slightly. "Would you like coffee? We were just about to have some." Deke Salter stayed for an hour. He left quieter than he arrived and didn't make trouble in Ember Flats after that. Colt watched Nora carry the empty cups back inside and thought she has more grace in an ordinary Wednesday than most people carry in a lifetime. Autumn brought the harvest and the kind of clear sky exhaustion that comes from productive work. Well done. They worked the harvest side by side with Sam Decker, and the yield confirmed what the spring planting had promised. The lower 40 had come through. The ledger showed numbers that hadn't appeared on a Whitfield farm record in years. Nora sat with the accounts on an October evening, the lamp burning low, the farm quiet around them. Colt was reading or trying to in the chair by the window she'd given up calling the guest chair. "The railroad surveyor came through last week," she said. "I heard." He confirmed the southern route, said the right-of-way negotiations would start in the spring. She turned a page. He said the corridor access fee schedule is already drafted. Colt looked up from his book. "What's it worth?" "Per acre per year for right-of-way easement." She quoted a figure. He stared at her. "That's not possible." "I had him write it down." She slid a piece of paper across the table. He picked it up, read it again. "Voss knew about this the whole time. Since before my father died." Nora's voice was level, not bitter. She'd moved past that somewhere in the spring. He sat across from a sick old man and offered him pennies on the pound for land he knew would be worth this. And when the old man said no, he spent 2 years engineering a way to take it anyway. And lost. And lost. She took the paper back. Pryor's letter this week said the prosecutor's case is solid. At least 4 other landowners with similar stories. Voss won't be in a position to harm anyone else. Colt set down his book. "What do you want to do with the money?" Nora looked at him. "What do you mean?" "The easement fees. It's your land. Your call." She shook her head. "Our land." She said it without ceremony, like a thing that had been decided long enough ago that restating it was just accuracy. "And I want to expand the horse operation. I want to finish the back sitting room properly." She paused. "And I want to put money in trust for Clara Holt's children. Their fathers have been gone 2 years, and she's doing it alone, and those kids deserve a start." Colt looked at her for a moment. "Done. You don't want to think about it." "What's there to think about?" He picked his book back up. "It's a good use." She watched him for a moment with the small private expression she'd developed over the course of the year, the one that appeared when he did something that still surprised her, though the surprises were less frequent now, because she'd learned to expect the best version of him and mostly received it. "Colt. I want to tell you something." He lowered the book. She was looking at him directly, both hands flat on the table, the ledger closed in front of her. "I used to think I was bad at this," she said. "At love. at being chosen and letting myself stay chosen without looking for the exit. She paused. My whole adult life I managed everything and needed nothing and told myself that was strength. She met his eyes. It was partly strength and partly hiding. And I'm done hiding. He waited. I'm not afraid anymore, she said simply. I thought you should know. It took me almost a full year, but I'm not afraid anymore. Colt set the book down entirely. He moved from the chair to the table and sat beside her instead of across. Good, he said. That's all you have to say. I've been waiting for you to get there. He took her hand. I wasn't going anywhere in the meantime. She turned her hand over and held his properly. Not the tentative, provisional grip of the early months, but the full decided hold of a person who has settled something. I know, she said. That's why I got there. On a Sunday in late October, they rode into Ember Flats for the first time in several weeks. The town looked like it always did in autumn, a little tired, a little golden. The storefronts, slightly faded from the summer sun, the street quieter than July. They pulled the wagon up in front of the church and climbed down with the easy coordination of two people who've done the same thing enough times that it requires no thought. People notice them differently now, not the stunned silence of the wedding day or the prurient watching of the town meeting. Just acknowledgement, a nod from someone on the boardwalk, a wave from across the street. Mrs. Lang came out of the dry goods as they passed. Morning, then to Nora. The new stock is in, if you have a minute after service. I'll stop by, Nora said. Old Harlan Burke intercepted Colt on the church steps. His grip was still strong. Heard the harvest report, he said. Lower 40 did well. Very well. You're planting. Nora's knowledge. Colt met the old man's eyes. She knows this land. I'm learning. Burke nodded approvingly. Good answer, boy. He shuffled inside. Ruth Daly stopped Nora just inside the door. I've been meaning to ask, the school's collection is thin this year. We're short on readers for the upper grades. She glanced at Colt and back. If you had any books to donate or time. Both, Nora said, and Ruth's face lit up. They settled into their usual back pew, shoulder to shoulder, not because they needed to perform it, but because that was where they ended up. Nora's hand found his in the middle of the first hymn and stayed there. Halfway through the service, the new minister, a young man named Calloway, who'd arrived from the East and was still acclimating to the particular textures of a small town's faith, said something that caught Colt off guard. He was talking about the difference between obligation and dedication, about how the outward form of duty and the inward form of love can look identical, and the difference only becomes clear over time in the accumulation of small choices. Colt wasn't a church man. He didn't intend to become one, but he recognized that particular truth when he heard it. He looked at Nora's profile, the set of her jaw, the directness of her gaze, the slight curl of her mouth when something in the sermon connected with something in her, the amber brooch at her collar. He thought about the paper Thomas Whitfield had left in his Bible. Everyone deserves someone who tries. He was still trying. He intended to keep trying for as long as the years allowed. After the service, walking back to the wagon through the autumn light with Nora's hand in his, Colt felt the particular satisfaction of a man who has arrived somewhere he hadn't planned to be and found it was exactly right. You look thoughtful, Nora said. Minister said something true. He does that occasionally. She glanced at him. What was it? That obligation and love looked the same from outside. He turned to help her up into the wagon. That the difference shows in the small choices over time. She settled on the bench, and I'm glad we had the time. He climbed up. Took us both a while, but we got here. Nora looked at the street of the town that had underestimated her for 30 years. Then she looked at him. We did, she said. Took us a while. She smiled. That real one, the one he'd first seen at Clara's door and had been chasing ever since. He picked up the reins and turned the horses toward home. The back sitting room was finished in November. Colt had worked on it in the margins of everything else early mornings before the day's main work evenings, when the light held long enough. It had taken him most of the autumn, which was longer than he'd planned because he'd kept finding things underneath the surface that needed doing properly. Rotten joist, warped floorboards, a section of plaster that looked sound but wasn't. He fixed all of it. Then he put in a new floor laid straight from the east wall so the morning light would run along it correctly. Whitewashed the walls, built a window seat under the east glass with a lid that opened for storage lined with the cedar from the old chest. He put nothing in it except a chair. He told Nora it was finished on a Tuesday morning. She'd been up since before him as usual, coffee already on. She looked at him and then at the doorway that led back to the room and then back at him. Go look, he said. She went. He heard her stop just inside the doorway. He heard nothing else for a long moment. Then Colt. He came to stand behind her. The morning light was exactly what her mother had wanted it to be, 30-some years delayed. It came through the east window and ran along the new floorboards in a clean line, turned the white walls warm and fell on the window seat, where the cedar still gave off its faint particular smell. I put the chair from the hall, he said, but it's your room. You can furnish it how you want. Nora turned around. Her expression had the quality of someone who has received something they didn't expect and doesn't quite know where to put it. You did this, she said. You told me what it should be. I mentioned it once. Once was enough. He looked at the room. Your mother had a good idea. 30 years late is better than not at all. Nora looked at the morning light on the floor. Her hand went to the amber brooch at her collar, a gesture she'd developed, half habit, half something else. She would have liked you, she said. He didn't know what to do with that, so he didn't try. He just stood there while she looked at the room her mother never got to use and let the morning be what it was. The first hard snow came in December, early and serious. They were 2 days into it before the wind broke enough to assess the damage. 2 sections of the old fence on the north boundary had come down under the weight of the drifts. The creek had frozen over in a way that blocked the cattle's usual water access, and one of the new elm saplings had been knocked sideways by the wind and needed resetting. Colt was out at first light, both mornings, Sam Decker alongside him, working methodically through the list. The cold was the kind that finds every gap in your coat and takes a personal interest in your fingers. Nora brought out coffee at mid-morning both days, which was not nothing. On the second day, she stayed to help with the fence repair. Colt watched her work, gloved hands steady, despite the cold wire stapler, efficient, not wasting a movement, and thought about the first fence they'd repaired together the morning after the wedding. The same efficiency, the same patience. You ever get tired of it, he asked. Of what? Of having to know how to do everything. He drove the last staple. You've been holding this place together since you were 17. Most people get to learn things gradually. You got handed the whole operation. Nora considered this while she wound the excess wire. I got tired of being necessary, she said. Years ago, it stopped feeling like capability and started feeling like... She paused. Like the only reason anyone kept me around. She looked at him. That part changed. When you started being necessary too. She said it simply. Not as a compliment, not as analysis, just as an observation. It's different when 2 people are both necessary. Less like burden, more like partnership. They walked back toward the barn, through the snow, and Colt thought about that. Partnership. He'd heard the word in business context in legal documents. He hadn't known until this year what it actually meant when applied to a life. It meant someone who split the weight without being asked. It meant trust that didn't require words. It meant showing up in the cold because the other person was already out in it. Sam Decker was at the barn door stamping snow off his boots when they arrived. North fence is solid, he said. Good, Colt said. The elm you resetting it took. I packed it in good. Should hold. Colt nodded. He looked back at the row of saplings along the south fence, their small branches heavy with snow, patient and rooted. 10 years. He was still planning ahead. Christmas came and went with less ceremony than Colt had experienced in a long time and more warmth than he'd expected. Clara Holt brought her children over on Christmas Eve for supper, and the house was loud and full in a way that filled up the corners. Rose Holt had graduated from biscuits to something involving cream and dried cherries that everyone ate twice. Old Harlan Burke arrived uninvited and unannounced at 10 o'clock with a jar of apple brandy and the unapologetic air of a man who knows he's welcome. Nora moved through the full house with the quiet ease of a woman in her proper element. Not managing, not performing, just present in her kitchen with her people around her. Colt stood in the doorway at one point and watched her, and Burke appeared at his shoulder. There she is, the old man said quietly. What do you mean? The version of her that's been in there all along. Burke took a slow sip of his brandy. The one the town didn't let surface because they needed the other version too much. The one that was useful and sad and convenient. He looked at Colt. You let this one out. Colt watched Nora laugh at something Rose had said, the full laugh, the unguarded one. She let herself out, he said. I just stopped being one more thing she had to brace against. Burke made a small sound of approval. Good answer, he said the same way he'd said it after the church. Then he shuffled back toward the brandy. After everyone had gone and the house was quiet, Nora was washing the last of the dishes. Colt came to dry, without asking, the way he always did now. Good evening, he said. Very good evening? She handed him a bowl. Harlan Burke brought brandy. I know. He told me about it approximately 3 times. She smiled. They worked through the stack in comfortable silence. Outside, the snow had started again light, this time the kind that falls without ambition. When they were done, Nora dried her hands and turned to face him with the look she'd worn on the October evening when she'd told him she wasn't afraid anymore. Direct, decided, warm. "Merry Christmas, Colt Reardon," she said. "Merry Christmas." She went up on her toes and kissed him, and he put his arms around her and kissed her back, and they stood in the lamplit kitchen with the snow falling outside and the house smelling of cream and dried cherries and apple brandy and cedar and everything that accumulates in a place that has been lived in and loved in for a long time. "I have something for you," she said when they parted. "You didn't need to." "I know." She went to the shelf above the sideboard and came back with a small package wrapped in the brown paper from the Mercantile. "I've been waiting for the right time." He unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a journal, leather-bound the cover, tooled with a simple pattern of sage and wheat. On the inside front cover in her precise handwriting, "For a man who plans ahead, N." He held it, looked at her. "For the 10-year plans," she said, "all the ones you keep making." He turned a few pages. "Good paper. Plenty of it." "Thank you," he said. She smiled. "Don't thank me yet. It comes with an expectation." "Which is?" "That you fill it." She met his eyes. "Not just the farm plans, all of it. Everything you're thinking ahead to." A pause. "I want to know what you're building toward." He looked at the blank first page for a moment. Then he looked at her. "You," he said. "Mostly I'm building toward you." Her expression did the thing it did when he surprised her, which happened less often now, and still made him glad when it did. "Then write that down," she said, "and everything after it." January settled over the farm with the particular quiet of deep winter. The kind of quiet that is not emptiness but accumulation. The slow building of something beneath the surface that won't show until spring. Nora had taken to using the back sitting room. Colt saw her there in the mornings before the day's full demands had assembled themselves just for 20 minutes or so, with the east light on the floor and a cup of tea and whatever book she was working through. She didn't make a ceremony of it. She just used the room, which was what rooms were for. He'd started writing in the journal. Not every day, he wasn't that kind of man, but when something landed in his mind that deserved to be kept. The planting notes, the horse observations, the particular calculations of what they might do with the rail fees when they came through. And other things. The way the farm looked in different lights. What Nora had said about partnerships standing in the snow by the north fence. The sound of Rose Holt laughing in the kitchen on Christmas Eve. He wrote those down too in the same practical hand he used for the planting notes because they seemed equally worth keeping. The journal lived on the side table in the sitting room. Once coming through, he found it moved slightly from where he'd left it, and when he opened to the last written page, there was a small annotation in Nora's handwriting beside his note about the elm saplings. "They're taking well." He left the journal where it was. In February, a letter came from James Pryor. Edmund Voss had been formally charged on 4 counts of fraudulent banking practice and 2 counts of probate manipulation. The territorial prosecutor had presented the case to a grand jury. The indictment had been returned in 2 hours. 3 of the 4 other landowners Pryor had identified had agreed to testify. The trial was scheduled for April. Neither Colt nor Nora would need to testify. Their evidence had been incorporated into the broader case, and Pryor expected the prosecution's existing witnesses were sufficient. The letter was informational, not a summons. Nora read it at the kitchen table and set it down without expression. "It's over," Colt said. "It's been over for months." She folded the letter. "This is just the formal part catching up." He sat across from her. "How do you feel about it?" She thought about it seriously the way she thought about most things. "I don't feel triumphant," she said finally. "I thought I would, but what I mostly feel is..." She paused. "Tired of the amount of my life that man took up." She looked at Colt. He was never worth the space he occupied. "No," Colt agreed. "I want to stop thinking about him." She pushed the letter to the side. "I want to think about the spring planting and the broodmares and the fence line on the east boundary that Sam says needs attention." "All of that sounds better." "Yes?" She stood to refill her cup. "Tell me about the east fence." He told her about the east fence, then about the broodmares they'd been considering from the Highfield breeder, then about the winter wheat variety he'd been reading about in the agricultural journal that had been arriving since October, a subscription he'd arranged without telling her, and which had turned out to be one of those small decisions that had an outsized effect on the quality of their evenings. They talked until the lamp burned low, which happened more often now. Conversations that started practical and move somewhere more interesting without either of them steering it there. He'd learned that Nora had opinions about nearly everything if you gave her space to offer them. She'd learned that he retained information from unexpected sources and could be surprised into genuine enthusiasm when something connected. He had concluded over the course of this year, the best part of being married to her. The discovery kept continuing. He'd started to believe it would go on indefinitely. He hoped so. He hoped it with the particular conviction of a man who has learned finally and for good the difference between what he needs and what he deserves. They were the same thing, it turned out. For the first time in his life, they were exactly the same thing. Spring returned to the Whitfield land with a particular authority, as if the ground itself had been waiting and was now done waiting. The elms broke green the second week of March, 12 small explosions of leaf along the south fence, each one so deliberate and certain that Colt went out to look at them 2 mornings in a row before he was satisfied they were as real as they appeared. Nora came out the second morning and stood beside him and said nothing because the elms didn't need commentary. The lower 40 was in early wheat again. The east boundary fence had been repaired through February by Sam Decker, who worked with a quiet professionalism that Colt had come to rely on the way you rely on good weather. It wasn't guaranteed, but it had been consistent long enough to plan around. The irrigation channels were open and running clean. The first 3 broodmares from the Highfield breeder had arrived in late February, settled into the expanded pasture with less difficulty than Nora had anticipated, and were already showing the quality that the breeder had advertised. The farm was not just surviving, it was becoming. On the second Saturday of April, Nora was in the back sitting room with the morning light in her tea when Colt came to the doorway. Pryor sent a note, he said. Voss pled guilty on 3 of the 4 counts. She looked up. Trial won't happen, Colt said. Yeah. Prosecutor accepted the plea. He'll serve time. The bank is under permanent receivership. Nora set down her cup. She looked at the east window at the light running across the floor her mother had wanted. How long, she asked. Pryor says the sentencing will determine that. But the counts are serious. He paused. He's not coming back from this. She was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded once, a small and final motion, the kind that closes a door. Good, but she said. And then, I'd like to ride out to the lower 40 today. Look at how the wheat is coming in. I was planning to do the same. Then we'll go together. She picked up her tea. After breakfast. That was all. That was the end of Edmund Voss in their life. Not a triumph, not a celebration, not a dramatic reckoning. Just a note and a nod and the decision to go look at the wheat. It was, Colt thought, exactly the right way to end it. They rode out to the lower 40 on a morning that smelled like everything that had ever been planted coming up at once. The wheat was about 8 inches pale green, dense, moving in the light wind, the way good grain does when it's healthy. Colt rode the edge of the field, slowly reading it, the way you read any text you've had a hand in writing. Nora rode slightly ahead, her posture easy, hat tilted back, taking in the field with the particular satisfaction of a woman looking at something she's been protecting her whole life and finding it intact. It's going to be a good year, she said. Yes, better than last year, significantly. She turned her horse to face him across the field. I want to add to it, she said. The Hendricks parcel east of the creek, they've been looking to sell for 2 years. If the rail fees come through at the rate the surveyor projected, we could make an offer. You've been thinking about this. I've been thinking about this since December. She held his gaze. I want to grow this farm, Colt. Not because I need to prove something to the town or to Voss or to anyone, because it's what this land can do and I want to see it do it. Colt turned his horse alongside hers and they looked at the field together. The wheat moving green and certain in the morning light, the elm saplings visible at the fence line in the distance. The Hendricks parcel is good ground, he said. Creek access on 2 sides. Yes, we'd need a third hand by fall if we took it on properly. Sam knows someone. He looked at her. You've already talked to Sam. I asked him a hypothetical question last month. The corner of her mouth moved. He gave me a hypothetical answer. Colt shook his head slowly. All right, he said. Write Pryor about the conveyance process. I'll talk to the bank about current lending terms, since we'll want the Hendricks deal in writing before the rail fees arrive. Nora's expression was the one he'd been seeing more of lately, the open one, the decided one, the one that didn't carry anything in reserve. Just like that, she said. You've clearly thought this through more carefully than anyone else involved. He turned his horse toward the path. I'm good at fence posts. I'll defer on property strategy. She laughed, the full one, the one he still caught himself noticing. They rode back through the spring morning and the farm opened up before them as they crested the low hill. The house with its repaired foundation and the cedar-lined window seat in the sitting room. The morning light loved the barn with its straight-hung doors, the south fence line, where 12 elms were green and growing, the irrigation channels running clean. Everything that had been broken or neglected or fighting to survive made whole. Everything that had been contested or endangered or leveraged against itself settled and secure. This was what 2 years looked like when both people meant it. Yeah. The Hendricks parcel closed in June. The rail fee agreement was signed in July, 3 weeks before the contractor crews arrived to begin the survey stakes for the southern quarter. The figure on the agreement was exactly what the surveyor had projected, and when the bank delivered the first quarterly payment, Nora looked at the number for a long time without expression, and then put the document in the desk drawer and went out to check on the broodmares. Colt followed her out. "You're not going to say anything about it?" he asked. She was checking the water in the trough, hand in the current, unhurried. "About what?" "The fees, the amount." "The amount doesn't change what we're going to do with it." She straightened. "We already know what we're doing with it." Still, she looked at him. "I felt something when I read it," she said. "I felt—" She paused. "Vindicated, I suppose, not for myself, for my father. He knew this land was worth what he held out for. He was right." She turned back to the mares, and Colt stood in the open pasture gate and thought about a man he'd never met who had written a letter in his Bible for whoever came after. Take care of her. He was trying. He intended to keep trying. Midsummer brought a heat that settled over the valley like a held breath, and with it came a piece of news that traveled through Ember Flats with the speed and character of something genuinely unexpected. It arrived via Clara Holt, who appeared on the Reardon porch on a Thursday afternoon with a look on her face that was equal parts urgency and suppressed delight. "I thought you should hear it from someone who, well, sit down." Nora, who had been shelling beans on the porch, set the bowl aside. Colt came out from the barn. Clara settled in the spare chair. "You know the Decker family from the north, County Sam's cousins? They came through town yesterday, traveling through on the way east." She paused. "They brought a story." The story, as Clara told it, involved a man formerly known in Ember Flats as Edmund Voss, attempting to establish a new line of credit under a different name in a river town 2 counties over. The attempt had been flagged by a territorial banking examiner who had Voss's description from the prosecution records. He had been detained and returned to custody to face the additional charges that the detour had generated. Clara delivered this information with the particular precision of someone who has been thinking about how to tell it since yesterday. Silence on the porch. Then Nora picked up her bowl of beans and resumed shelling. "Good," she said. Clara watched her for a moment. "That's it." "What more is there?" Nora looked up. "He made his choices. The law made its choices. We made ours." She nodded toward the north field where the Hendricks pasture was visible through the tree line. "The wheat's coming in well. The mares are doing well. The elms are 2 feet taller than they were in March." She met Clara's eyes. "I'm not giving him more space in my afternoon." Clara looked at Colt. He shrugged slightly. "She's right." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she settled back in her chair with the expression of a woman who has been given an example she intends to remember. "All right," she said. "In that case, tell me about the mares." August was long and productive. September came cool and clear, and the harvest exceeded the already strong projections. At the end of September, Colt rode out early alone to check the water situation in the South Channel, a task that didn't actually require riding out alone, but he wanted an hour in the quiet of the early morning to think. He'd been thinking about a question for several weeks, not because he was uncertain of the answer. He was as certain of the answer as he'd been of anything in his life. But the question was the kind that needed its timing respected, and he'd learned in the course of this year that timing was not a trivial thing. He came back to find Nora in the sitting room with her tea in the morning light and the journal open on the side table, which startled him. "You've been reading it," he said. She looked up without guilt. "You left it open." "I did." He leaned in the doorway. "What did you read?" She touched the open page. "This part." She read aloud in her direct, even voice. She said it was different when 2 people are both necessary. "I've been thinking about that." I think what she meant is that love is different from usefulness. Usefulness asks, "What do you need?" Love asks, "What do you want?" She's been answering the first question for most of her life. I'm trying to be someone who asks the second one. She closed the journal, looked at him. He came into the room and sat on the window seat across from her chair. "I've been thinking about a question," he said. "I've been thinking about it for a while." She waited the morning light between them. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said. Not because of a deed or a will or a banker's arrangement, not because we're legally required to be here, because I want to stand up in front of people and say that I chose you, clearly and on purpose. He held her gaze. I want to do the ceremony right this time, with time to think about what we're saying and someone to say it to. Nora was very still. We're already married, she said. I know. Legally, completely, I know. He leaned forward slightly. I want to do it again, for the right reasons this time, so that when people ask how we got here, the answer isn't a banker's deal and a borrowed dress. The answer is we chose each other. The morning light ran along the floor between them. Nora set down her tea. She turned the amber brooch at her collar, the small, habitual gesture he'd come to know as her equivalent of thinking carefully. You want a real wedding, she said. I want a real wedding. Small, she said. Just the people who matter. Clara and the children. Harlan Burke, Mrs. Liang, Ruth, Sam. A pause. Pryor, if he can make the trip. Whoever you want. She looked at him for a long, steady moment. The woman who had spent 32 years deciding she was the sort of person things didn't happen to and had been wrong about it. Yes, she said, I'll marry you again. He smiled, the full version, the one he didn't deploy often enough that it still surprised her. Same answer as last time. Better circumstances. Considerably. She stood and crossed to the window seat and sat beside him, and he put his arm around her and they looked out at the farm together, the wheat fields and the elm line, and the new pasture where the Hendricks land began, and the whole wide-open future of it. And that. The second wedding of Colt and Nora Reardon took place on the first Saturday of October in the yard of the Whitfield farm in front of the south fence, where 12 elms stood in a row with their autumn color coming in. Minister Calloway performed it. He had written new words for the occasion at Nora's request, nothing about duty or social arrangement, just the plain language of two people who had figured something out the hard way and wanted to say it out loud. Colt wore the same clothes he'd worn every working day for the past year, which were the only good clothes he owned, which Nora had pressed and set out without comment. She wore a dress that was hers, not borrowed, not adjusted, not too tight at the shoulders. Deep blue, the color of late October sky, with the amber brooch at the collar. She walked across the yard toward him, and he had to remind himself to breathe. Clara Holt was crying before the ceremony started. Rose Holt told her to stop it and then cried herself. Old Harlan Burke stood between them with his hat in his hands and the expression of a man who has outlived most of what mattered to him and is profoundly grateful to be present for something new. Mrs. Liang had brought flowers from the mercantile late-season asters and goldenrod arranged in 2 mason jars that flanked the spot where Calloway stood. Sam Decker stood at the back with the quiet dignity of a man who understands what he's witnessing. James Pryor had made the trip from Dunmore. He stood beside Sam, looking slightly out of his professional context and entirely at ease with it. When Calloway reached the vows, he paused and looked at them both. You've been asked to make promises before, he said. I'd like you to make them again. Not because the first ones didn't count. They counted. This is just saying clearly what you've already proven. Colt took Nora's hands. They were the hands of a woman who had worked hard her whole life, rough at the knuckle, steady as anything he had ever held. He said the vows, not because they were required, because they were true. Nora said them back, her voice clear and direct, her eyes on his, no flinching, no reservation. Not the careful endurance of someone going through necessary motions. The full and present attention of a woman who had decided to be here completely. When Calloway pronounced them married again, still finally Clara Holt stopped trying not to cry, and Harlan Burke said about time loud enough to be heard, and Nora laughed, and Colt kissed her there, in the October light, with the elm trees behind them, and the whole of their life spread out on every side. The celebration lasted until dark and past it. Clara had brought more food than 12 people could eat. Ruth Daly had contributed something involving apples and cinnamon that disappeared completely in the first 20 minutes. Harlan Burke had brought 2 jars of apple brandy this time, in the manner of a man who has learned from experience. Sam Decker turned out to have a surprisingly good voice, and knew most of the words to several songs that the assembled group did not, but found they could follow if he sang them twice. Pryor toasted the couple with the careful brevity of a man who speaks for a living and knows when not to. To the Reardons, he said, who made my job considerably more interesting than I expected when I took this case, and who I think would have found each other under any circumstances. Clara raised her glass. To the farm which held everything together while these two figured themselves out. Old Harlan Burke raised his jar. To the elms, he said. which will be here long after all of us. They drank to the elms. After the guests had gone, the yard quiet and the night clear and cold with the stars coming out hard and bright, Colt and Nora stood together at the south fence looking at the elm row. "Burke's right," she said. "They'll outlast us." "That's the idea." Colt looked down the row of trees, small and certain and patient. "Something that keeps going." Nora leaned against him, her head against his shoulder, the way she'd learned to rest in him without reservation. "I've been thinking about something," she said. "Tell me." "The back room, the sitting room," she paused. "I'd like to make it something else. Later, when the time is right." He looked down at her. "What kind of something else?" She turned to face him, and in the lamplight from the house windows behind them, her expression was the most unguarded he had ever seen it, open and bright and quietly, completely certain. "A child's room," she said, "someday." Colt held very still for a moment, the way you hold still when something arrives that you didn't plan for and find you want more than you knew. "Someday," he said. "Not tomorrow," a quiet smile, "but someday." He put his arms around her there at the fence line under the stars beside the 12 elm saplings that would be trees by the time any child they had could climb them. He held her the way you hold something that matters entirely, and she held him back with the same conviction. The farm lay quiet around them. The wheat fields resting, the mare settled, the irrigation channels closed for the season, the journal on the table in the sitting room with its blank pages still ahead, the house with the cedar window seat and the morning light, the fence lines running true. Everything built, everything chosen, everything still going. "We should go in," Nora said. "It's cold." "Yeah." But neither of them moved for another long moment, looking at the farm and the stars and the elm trees and all the years ahead of them that were blank and good and entirely theirs. Then they walked inside together into the warmth of the house they'd made and closed the door behind them. The elms stood in their row in the quiet, dark, patient, and growing exactly as planned. NCB 34. 6 months later, Ember Flats held its first annual harvest fair. It had been Ruth Daly's idea, which had become the town council's idea by the time anyone mentioned it publicly, which is how good ideas tend to travel in small towns. The organizing committee met 3 times at the schoolhouse. Nora had attended one of those meetings at Ruth's direct request and had ended up agreeing to provide horses for the children's riding demonstration, which was how she found herself on the second Saturday of October, standing at the gate of the demonstration ring, while 12 children tried to convince 3 cooperative mares that they were cowboys. The fair had taken over the main street in the church grounds and most of the adjacent field, which had been cleared and raked for the occasion. There were tables of produce and preserved goods and livestock assessments and a pie competition that Mrs. Liang had won for the 3rd consecutive year in a category she'd essentially invented. Colt was at the livestock pens with Sam Decker discussing winter feeding strategy with a group of ranchers who had questions about the broodmare operation, which had become locally significant faster than either of them had anticipated. The Reardon horses were already acquiring a quiet reputation for quality, the kind of reputation that starts with one person telling another person and arrives at the 4th person already sounding like established fact. Harlan Burke wandered past at one point with a cup of cider and the expression of a man who has attended every version of this town's communal life for 60 years and remains reliably pleased to find it continuing. "How are the elms?" he asked Colt. 3 feet now. Burke nodded, satisfied, and wandered on. The afternoon moved through its own quiet momentum. Children on mares, cider in cups, the particular sound of a community doing something together for no reason more complicated than the fact that it was something to do together. Near the end of the afternoon, Colt found Nora at the edge of the demonstration ring, watching the last of the children finish their slow circuit of the ring on one of the broodmares. A girl of about 8 had figured out the rhythm of the mare's walk and was sitting very straight with the precise satisfaction of someone who has just understood something for the first time. "She's good," Colt said. "She has good instincts." Nora watched the girl. She didn't push. She just waited for the horse to decide. He glanced at her. "Sounds familiar." She smiled without looking at him. "Are you comparing me to a horse?" "I'm comparing your method to the horses," he paused. "You waited for me to decide too." "I waited for a long time." "You did." He stood beside her, watching the girl bring the mare to a clean stop at the gate. "Thank you for that." Nora looked at him sideways. "I was protecting myself." "I know, thank you anyway." The girl dismounted with slightly too much drama, both feet hitting the ground, a triumphant look at the audience. A woman at the fence called her name, And the girl ran to her, and the small, warm transaction of parent and child was what it always was, ordinary and entire. Nora watched it. "We're going to be all right," she said quietly. He looked at her, the amber brooch at her collar, the October light on her face. "We've been all right for a while," he said. "I know." She turned to face him fully. "But I'm saying it out loud, because I want to hear it." Her eyes were steady and clear and completely present. "We're going to be all right. This farm, this life, everything we're building." She paused. "Us." "Yes," he said, "all of it." She reached up and put her palm against his jaw, the gesture she developed that said what the words didn't need to. He covered her hand with his and held it there, the two of them standing in the middle of the harvest fair with everything they'd built around them and everything still ahead. "Come on," she said. "Mrs. Liang is defending her pie title, and I want to see the competition judged." He followed her into the fair, into the crowd and the cider smell and the children and the autumn light, into all of it, into the life they'd built. 2 years after the wedding, the first one, the bad circumstances, one Colt sat in the back sitting room on a quiet Sunday morning and wrote in the journal. Nora was still asleep upstairs. He'd been awake since before dawn, which happened more often now. He'd become a man who liked the early morning in the way that farmers do when the day is still being decided and the light hasn't committed yet. The elms were over 4 feet now, visible from the east window if you leaned to the right angle, which he was doing. He wrote 2 years. "The farm is doing well, better than I projected. The Hendricks parcel has been worth every dollar. The rail fees are ahead of schedule. Sam has found us a fourth hand for the spring." He paused. Then, "None of that is the important part." He looked out the window at the elm row. "The important part is that Nora laughs at breakfast now. Every day, almost at something small, something Sam says, or something I do, or something the horses do. Just a real laugh easy. She didn't used to do that. She was careful with it the way you're careful with things that can be taken from you. I think she stopped being careful around the time she stopped needing to be, which was around the time she decided to believe me, which took considerably longer than I wanted, and exactly as long as it should have." He looked at the blank page below. "She told me last week she thinks she's expecting. She said it the same way she says everything important, directly without preamble, watching my face while she said it. I told her that was the best news I'd had since she agreed to try the second time. She corrected me. She said the best news was when I told her I was staying. She was right. That was the best news. It just took me a while to understand that I was the one who received it." He set down the pen, picked up his coffee, looked at the east window and the light on the floor and the elm tops just visible over the fence line. Thomas Whitfield had written his letter in this house, at this desk, for the person who came after. He'd been trying to make sure his daughter would be all right. Colt wrote one more line. "She is. We both are. I think he'd be glad to know." He closed the journal, put it on the side table where it lived. Upstairs, he heard Nora begin to move the small sounds of the house, waking floorboards and the particular creak of the bedroom door that he knew as well as his own name now. He went to start the coffee that was already on. She came downstairs and found him in the kitchen and sat across from him at the table that had been the center of everything. Every important conversation, every difficult truth, every ordinary evening that had added up to a life. "Morning," she said. "Morning." She poured her cup, looked at him across the table with the direct, decided, warm look that was the look of her, the look he'd been watching for since before he knew he was watching for it. "The elms are taller," she said. 4 feet. She nodded slowly, a small private smile. "Good." Outside, the farm was waking up in its steady way, the horses beginning to move in the pasture, the spring birds loud and various, the whole wide acreage of the Whitfield land alive and under care and building toward everything it could be. 2 people at a kitchen table, coffee going, the day ahead, everything chosen, everything still. The elms growing patient and sure in their row along the fence. NCB 34 complete. Defector. The spring after that first harvest fair became the landmark by which later years were measured. It was the spring the south well was deepened and stopped running low in August. The spring the first foal was born from the Highfield broodmares, a roan filly that Nora named Patience, and Sam Decker refused to accept, was named that until he'd called her by it for 3 weeks straight. The spring that Sam's cousin's family moved onto the Hendricks parcel in the north section as the fourth hand colt had hired, and the farm operation crossed from one family's effort into something that required real management. It was also the spring, late April, early morning. The elms now shoulder height along the south fence, when Nora came downstairs and Colt looked at her from across the kitchen and said, "Today?" "Maybe," she said. "We'll know by noon." By noon they knew. By evening, Clara Holt was at the farmhouse and Colt was in the yard in the particular helpless state of a man who is needed nowhere and cannot be still. Old Harlan Burke found him out there. "Go inside," Burke said. Clara said to wait. "Then wait inside." Burke sat on the porch step with his customary authority. "At least you won't wear a path in the yard." Colt sat down beside him. They sat in the late evening quiet, the farm settling around them. The sound from inside the house carrying to the porch and then going quiet and then carrying again. "You're going to be Bartayi," Burke said. "I know. She's going to be fine." "I know that too." Burke was quiet, then, "You know what I told her, Nora, about 6 months after the hearing? She asked me once if I thought she'd made the right choice." Colt looked at him. "What did you tell her?" "I told her that the right choice was the one she was already making every day." Burke looked at his hands, which shook slightly in the cooling air. She'd been asking the question wrong. She was asking, did I choose correctly at the start? The right question is, am I choosing correctly now? He paused. She was. She is. He looked at Colt. "Both of you." Inside the house, a sound that was new. Clara Holt appeared in the doorway a few minutes later, her face doing the thing that faces do when they've been present for the particular miracle of arrival. "Go in," she said to Colt. He went in. What was in the room was Nora, tired and certain and present in the specific way of a woman who has just done something enormous and is already past the enormous part and into whatever comes next. And in her arms, the small and absolute beginning of the next chapter of the Whitfield land. "Come see," Nora said. He came to see. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at what they'd made pink and impatient, and already objecting loudly to the general situation, which seemed like a good sign. "She looks like she has opinions," he said. "She already does." Nora's voice was the most tired and most complete he'd ever heard it. She came out objecting to everything. "Good." He looked at Nora. "How are you?" "Very well." She met his eyes with the steady directness that was her whole character. "Ask me again in the morning." He put his hand on her face, the gesture the same one repeated back. She leaned into it. Outside the window in the April dusk, the elm trees stood in their row along the south fence, 5 feet now taller than he'd expected for 2 years, moving slightly in the evening wind. Patient and certain and built to last. Thomas Whitfield had planted this house and this land and this life. His daughter had held it against everything that tried to take it. And now, in the spring evening, the next version of the Whitfield farm was beginning, loud, opinionated, and entirely unexpected, exactly as all true things are. "What are we calling her?" Colt asked. Nora looked at their daughter, who had stopped objecting and was now regarding the situation with the focused interest of someone taking inventory. "Margaret," Nora said, "after my mother." He repeated it. It fit. Outside the elms, inside the lamp. Between them, the continuing story of a farm and a family that had survived the wrong beginning and built the right middle and was still stubbornly daily by choice going. The best marriages weren't built on perfect starts. They were built on what came after, on the choosing and the showing up and the small, persistent decision to be present for whatever the next day held. On 2 people in a kitchen at morning with the coffee on and the farm alive outside the window and everything still ahead. On the daily, ordinary, extraordinary act of staying,